no employees ever come to look for him. It's pouring rain both days, and for 2 days, employees come and go taking out the trash and not seeing him. But then, on the third day in the morning sunshine, clear as day, the gate just slowly opens by itself. Nobody comes, nobody goes. The gate just opens by itself, and the body is there in the same position it was 2.5 days earlier. I had literally felt chills down my spine when I saw this too, and to this day I just simply cannot explain it without thinking that it was actually paranormal. Anyway, a couple of hours later, an employee walks out with a trash bag, sees the body, freaks out and calls the cops. I didn't write it, but we basically had to write a report on how a gate apparently just opened itself. Last Thanksgiving, I was driving home from college with my friend, both 21 and female at the time. I live in a very isolated part of Arkansas that requires driving through an hour of hairpin turns in the mountains. There are lots of blind spots, and the whole time you're driving on the edge of just huge drop-offs with no barriers. I'm usually pretty confident driving through the mountains, but we were in my friend's car, so I was going slower than usual, driving about 5 over the speed limit. So, almost as soon as we started the roughest part of the drive, another car was tailgating us pretty close. This was stressing me out, and as soon as I saw somewhere that I could pull over, I did. I pulled into a church parking lot, and my friend offered to drive the rest of the way, but I declined as it was completely dark and she had never driven this route before. We got back on our way though, and a few minutes later, I have to come to a screeching halt as there's a car stopped in the middle of the road. It wasn't on the shoulder at all, but just stopped dead in the middle of the road. My friend is saying that they must have broken down, but can't call a tow because there's no service in this area. I, on the other hand, immediately have a bad feeling and lock the doors. I tell my friend to stay in the car no matter what, as she's starting to get scared at this point and points out that she thinks it was the car that was following us. I can't tell, but I'm pretty scared at this point. It's parked right before a hairpin turn too, so I can't pass it. My friend starts frantically telling me to go ahead and pass it, but I don't want to get hit by a Mack truck or fall off the mountain or something. So I honk my horn. Nothing happens. No chance of calling for help as there's no cell service, like I said, so we just wait there for a while, doing nothing. My friend is crying and freaking out, but I'm too scared to try and pass them. I honk a couple of times, and eventually a guy gets out of the car, comes around back, and leans against his car, just staring at us. My friend is freaking out even more, and I'm just frozen. I tell her not to make eye contact. I'm ready to floor it if he does something, but he just stands there, staring. Mind you, he's not checking his car or anything either. I try to stay calm and just pray that another car will come along soon. This goes on for what seems like forever, but was probably 15 plus minutes. He's just casually leaning against his car, just looking at us. Eventually we see car lights in our rear view, and then the guy jogs to his door and gets back in his car. He speeds off, going dangerously fast. So there was obviously nothing wrong with his car. I start driving, not wanting to cause a wreck. We don't see anything else for a while, but we pass the same car parked along the highway a while later, and it pulls back on and starts tailing us again. I try to speed up and get rid of him, but he just keeps following us. We have cell service at this point, but I don't know if we should call the cops because, well, nothing really happened. I call home and I tell my brothers what's going on and tell them to wait on the porch for us. And the car follows me all the way home, down the really long drive to my house as well. I get to my house and my 2 brothers are waiting on the porch holding their deer rifles. I pull in and the car just goes to the end of the drive, loops around, and speeds off back the way it came. We tried to catch its plates, but we just couldn't make them out in the dark like that. Needless to say, me and my friend were really freaked out, but when I told other friends the whole story, they just didn't think it was a big deal. What do you guys think happened that night? This happened a few years ago when I was maybe 15 or 16. I used to not have blinds or curtains on my windows, and I never bothered to get something to cover them up for a long time. My street is fairly rural, and we know all of our neighbours fairly well, so I was never really worried about something weird happening. That is, until this night. It was sometime in the winter. I've always been a bit of a night owl, so I was up late on my computer. I had the light in my room on, but it was pitch black outside, so I couldn't see anything out the window. It was completely silent in my house when I heard it. 3 loud bangs on my window. It scared me so bad that I fell off my bed and I stayed down there for a while. Eventually, I convinced myself that it must have been some kind of an animal, like a bat or something, that just flew into my window. I calmed myself down and I went back to whatever the hell I was doing, and I didn't really think much of it after that. I just never bothered to mention it to anyone, until a few nights later around the same time. I had my window cracked open, still with no blinds covering it, when I heard leaves crunching outside like somebody was walking on them. They stopped right outside of my window, but it was still too dark for me to see what was out there. At this point, I probably should have screamed for my parents or called the police or something, because I could just feel someone just staring directly at me, and I could feel that they had bad intentions. I was too scared to even move, but I just knew somehow that there was someone out there. So I did the only thing that I could think of at the time. I stared directly into the pitch blackness outside of the window, put on the most intimidating face that I could manage, and stayed like that. I must have sat in that position for a good 5 minutes until I heard the footsteps again, this time leading away from my window. I shut the window and tacked a blanket around it after I couldn't hear the footsteps anymore, and I barely slept that night. The next day I bought a pair of blinds and told my mum about the incident when we were at the store. I said to her that I heard footsteps outside my window last night. My mum doesn't get scared or intimidated easily, as she's one of the most fearless people I know, in fact. But as soon as those words left my mouth, she just turned white. She said, "Did you tell your dad about that?" And I told her no, I hadn't told my dad, and asked why she wanted to know. She looked me straight in the eyes and told me just one of the most bone-chilling things that I've ever heard. "Honey, your dad was talking to our neighbor this morning. She told him that she had seen a man walking around our yard for the past few nights. And last night she saw him walking towards your window, but he disappeared into the dark before she could figure out if it was one of us or not. She said after a few minutes that he left, apparently, but he came back a few hours later and she saw him while getting ready for work. She knew then that it wasn't one of us this time since the sun was coming up, and he also had a knife in his hand. She went outside and screamed for him to leave, but instead of running down the street, he ran into our backyard and then into the woods. I live in a military neighborhood, and all of my neighbors are active duty, which tends to make me feel pretty safe if something were to happen, but after I just heard that there was a creepy man outside my window in the woods more than once, and that he ran into our backyard instead of down the street, I don't think any amount of military would make me feel safe after that. My parents never let me stay over at my boyfriend's house back then, but after that night, she let me stay at my boyfriend's house for almost a week. And when I got back home, my blinds were installed and there was a curtain over the window, and the window lock that was previously broken was now fixed. I haven't unlocked or opened that window since this happened, and we never saw or heard about this guy again. My neighbor never saw anything again, and we just reported the incident, but never heard anything about it after that. I don't know who he was or what he looked like, but I sure hope that he doesn't come back. I live on an island where most people live near the coast, but my childhood house was deep in the mountains. Imagine a house in the woods, but at the very top of a mountain if you can. The house is surrounded by thick mist every night, like in the bad horror movies, and the woods around it start less than 2 feet from the outer walls of the house. Our closest neighbour is a 15-minute drive away, and 5 minutes away there's also an abandoned house. I think the house belonged to a distant relative or something, but was abandoned more than 40 years ago. There's no streetlights, and there's all kinds of animals roaming the area. This is important to the story because even though you couldn't see a group of 10 people hiding like 1 meter away from you in the woods, you could hear absolutely everything, right up to a couple of kilometers away, in fact. If we saw car lights or heard a car approaching, me and my family would turn off the lights and we would hide. I don't know why, we were just shy and antisocial, you name it. But anyway, I think that's enough to set the story up. I'll add some details along the way that may be important. But my house is small and impoverished, and our family car was a good one. I don't really know much about cars, but my dad always said that without a really good car, we wouldn't be able to go up and down the mountain that we lived in. Also, there's currently 8 people inside of our house around 11 p.m. So, I'm at the dining table just enjoying some cereal while I'm watching some anime. Basically just kind of having the time of my life. The lights to the house were on, so nothing could be seen in the dark outside. There's a window in front of me that gives sight to the front of the entrance of the house and onto the road. And just then, something calls my attention, but I don't hear or see anything. I think that I see a human silhouette outside, but it doesn't move, so I just ignore it as some effect of the lights in the house and my own reflection or something. More anime, more cereal, and I feel something move at the other side of the window, and this time, the silhouette is waving at me. I felt my heart jump out of my chest, and I froze. The person outside waves at me as if trying to make sure that nobody else in the house is noticing him. After maybe 10 seconds, in which I'm just looking at him with a spoon halfway to my mouth, he decides to say hello. He then says, "I need help." My parents hear this and they approach the window, which made me sure that I wasn't just looking at a ghost, which was amazing news for me. But the man outside starts telling a story about how he got his car stolen at gunpoint and needs help. My parents are surprised that nobody heard his footsteps or a car or anything, so they whisper their theories amongst themselves. For this mysterious guy's story to be true, he had to be mugged more than a mile away, get his car stolen, and then walk for half an hour in the dark through the woods, following the dim light of our house. It may sound crazy, but my parents decided to actually believe him, and they offer calling the police. But our visitor begs and says the stupidest thing that he could have. He says, "Don't call the police, I don't have a gun." My parents stay silent for a while. The guy outside knows that he's messed up, but proceeds to make his request. He asks, "Can I get a ride downtown?" My dad nervously chuckles and gives him some sort of an excuse. He mentions the time, the fact that he felt the guy was lying and that he had already called the police, which was a lie in fact. And this is when my favorite part of the story begins. I stand up from the table, shaking. I go to a closet, and even though I can't see the guy's face, I know that he's following my actions. I get 2 machetes that are half my size and run to another room. I was terrified, and looking back, I probably took away the only weapons my parents could have used to protect themselves in case of an altercation. But I opened the door to my room where me and my siblings sleep, and they were watching some silly show, probably something stupid like Hannah Montana or iCarly, and their hyena laughter came out. My sisters are really loud, and my younger brothers are 4 years old, 7 years old, and 9 years old, so their laughs are angelical by day and demonic by night. But I signal at them to shut the hell up, and they do so, joining me and my parents in our fear. We sit there in silence as the guy says, "It's okay. If you can't help me, I'll just go to the next house, alright?" My dad says, "There is no next house. You should wait for the police here." "I don't need the police. I'm good." This goes back and forth. The guy is now in good shape apparently to walk an hour down the mountain to reach downtown. My dad offers a rusty metal tricycle from our porch so that he can go downtown as a bit of a joke. And the guy accepts this offer and grabs the tricycle. I assume that he just wanted to leave with something. but this tricycle is like 20 years old and it definitely doesn't work now. We hear the screeching of the tricycle for a couple of seconds as the stranger just struggled to be able to ride it, and then it stopped not too far away from our house. At least, it seemed like he stopped, and we didn't hear any footsteps that indicated the guy had left. And after trying to identify if he was still on site to no avail, my dad finally calls the police. We wait in silence, looking at the road from the front windows. 15 minutes later, the police get there, which was an amazing time back home, heroic even. And as soon as the red and blue lights show up, they illuminate the entire road up to the abandoned house. The tricycle is still on the road not too far away. The police claim not seeing anybody on the road. There's only one road into the mountain, and if the guy kept on walking, they definitely would have seen him. So they take a look in the woods with a flashlight, and after that, they just called it a day. The cops were clearly freaked out by the eerie look of the house, though, and they didn't stay for more than 5 minutes. Luckily, nothing else happened that night, and I slept with 2 machetes under my pillow, which I remember angered one of my sisters. But to this day, we have no idea who the person was. There were no carjackings reported the next day, and even though a lot of weird things happened around my house, we never saw this guy again. It's pretty obvious he was trying to steal our family's car, but there were a few things that we could just never understand. Like, where the hell did he come from? Where the hell did he go as well? If his story was true, he had the worst luck in the world, I suppose. I think the situation was interesting, though, because I often think about his point of view and how Horror Night turns a bit, well, comical. I mean, imagine this. You go to rob a house, it turns out the people inside speak calmly. I don't know how much criminals encounter this as they try to intimidate or deceive. There's a scrawny, seemingly mute kid that tries to be sneaky and grabbing some machetes and then hide in the darkness in the house. And then there's child's laughter coming from non-visible rooms from the house. He could see the doors, but the inside of the rooms would be geometrically impossible to look into from the windows. And in the end, I think that we were lucky to kind of out-creep the creep that night. Because I just don't see any other reason for the guy to back out from his plans. The guy clearly had a gun and bad intentions, not to mention his ability to ninja walk through a forest where we even heard wild cats walking around. And also, no neighbors to witness or hear anything. Prior to 2016, I lived in Palmdale, California. My sister Honey and my youngest daughter lived with my mother in a rented townhouse apartment in Oxford, about 2 hours away. Every week or two, I made the long drive to take them shopping and clean their house because they were both disabled. My mother was my heart and my sweet sister helped raise me, so anything they needed, I was always there for them. On the first floor, the kitchen was in the back with a door that opened to the backyard, then a big open space, and then the living room and the front door. On the right was the bathroom and my mother's bedroom. The stairs were on the left with a half-wall railing going up to the first landing. My mum was sitting in her lift recliner on the right facing the base of the stairs. One night we were all sitting in the living room just watching a show with the lights on, and my daughter was upstairs in her room. We were laughing at something we saw on the TV when I saw something on the stairs. It darted down the steps real fast, picking up at me, and then ducked back down behind the railing, followed by just a cold chill that entered the living room. My mother even commented that it was cold and put a robe together. At first, I thought it was my daughter playing tricks on me, but when she didn't pop up, I honestly felt concerned. So I said, "Mama, did you see something?" Because she had full sight of anything there. She said, "No, dear, I thought that I did, but there's nothing there." That's when it hit me, and instinctively, I just knew what it was and where it even came from. I ran up the stairs and burst into my daughter's room, and I said, "What did you do?" She looked at me with her eyes wide. She knew exactly what I was referring to and started apologizing. I told her, tell me what she did to bring it into this house, and she proceeded to tell me that when her girlfriends were there that they thought it would be fun to try and summon a spirit. Then they tried to reach the father of one of her friends who passed away 2 years prior, but she said something else came through and it scared them, so they stopped and her friends ran home without even saying goodbye. And well, I was furious. I said, "How dare you play with something you don't understand?" I told her that I knew that she was just trying to help her friend, but for heaven's sake, I warned her years ago to never mess around with things that she didn't understand and had no control over. I was thinking that not only do I constantly worry about my family's health now, but I have to worry about this. I asked if she at least closed the door, and she just looked at me with a blank stare, and obviously she didn't. She said that they made a Ouija board out of paper and that when they were done, she just ripped it up and threw it away. I told her that that door had to be closed. So we gathered the pieces and she called her friends. 2 of them were too scared to come back, so we had to perform the closing without them, but in the back of my head, I knew that it didn't work and it was still there hiding somewhere. At that point, there was nothing that I could have done viewing the circumstances at the time. So fast forward to 2016. I had an opportunity waiting for me in Washington State, so I begged and pleaded for my mother and sister to go with me, but my sister Honey was fanatically scared of change, and although my mother desperately wanted to go with me, she just couldn't leave my sister's side. I wish now that I would have been more persistent. So I moved, reluctantly leaving them with my daughter and her now husband to take over their care. And within those 2 years, my elder sister Honey's health severely declined, and my mother shared with me 8 months after I moved that she was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. I flew and drove back and forth to be with them, and every time I showed them pretty pictures of my new life and our beautiful green surroundings, asking them to return with me, and every time, Honey would say that she was just too apprehensive to leave and said no. And in 2018, they both passed away. My mother from cancer and my sister from an existing illness, taking a big part of my heart and my soul with them. My daughter and her husband moved out, leaving all of my mother and sister's things there. Somebody had to put their stuff in storage, and of course it had to be me. And even though I was the youngest of 6, I felt it was my duty. I drove there with my 2 grandchildren, 8 and 4, because at the time there was just no one available to watch them. And when we arrived, the place was just in shambles. Dirty dishes and moldy food lined the counters and was piled up in the sink, and it looked like soot just all over the floor. Mum and Honey's personal belongings were strewn around the house, and in my mother's room, a barricade of trash was piled up all the way to her door. In the middle of the floor in the open space was a full-length mirror that I had never seen before, just hanging off of a wooden ladder. And quite honestly, I just stood there and I cried. I set up a clean spot in the living room for my grandson to play on his tablet with, and my granddaughter wanted to help. As I was bagging things up in the kitchen, I noticed her just standing there staring into the mirror. I didn't think anything of it, but she just kept standing there. Then I heard her say to me while not looking away, "Nana, can you get rid of this mirror?" I thought she wanted to move it, but she was adamant that it had to be taken out of the house. I asked her why she looked so scared, and she told me that while she was looking into the mirror, she was standing there alone, and she couldn't see anything in the reflection around or behind her, just darkness all around her, and she felt like something was coming. I looked at the mirror too, not at myself, and I must admit that it did look very dark. It was strange because it really shouldn't have been, but it was. So, say no more. Not only did I take it outside, but I smashed it into a million pieces and threw it in the trash can. We decided to sleep in the living room, and it took days to even come close to being done. But this happened on the last night, and we were alone. I just mopped downstairs, so I locked the doors and all the windows in the whole house, and we slept upstairs in the bedroom across from my daughter's old room. We hunkered down on some mattresses on the floor, and I always left a light on in the hall. I'm reading a book online. My granddaughter had fallen to sleep next to me, and my grandson was on his tablet at the end of the bed. I was getting sleepy, and my grandson started to yawn. He looked up from his tablet, and his eyes got big, and he ran to the door and shouted, "Spooky," and slammed it, running back to me quickly and got under the covers, and got as close to me as he could, making me feel really uneasy. And when I looked, I could see movement in the hall, dimming the light around and under the door, making swirling strange shapes as if someone were pacing, followed by surges of blackness and wisps of cool air coming from the space under the door. And that night was long, and I felt on guard until I finally fell asleep as well, but I woke up hours later and had to go to the bathroom, but I was just too scared. I was just laying there waiting until daybreak, but I just couldn't wait any longer. So I slowly opened the door, fearing for what was waiting for me on the other side, but when I did, there was nothing. But at the same time, I just knew that there was something there. I could feel it. I tried to be as fast as I could, and I left the bathroom door open so that I could hear the kids, and then I ran back. Hearing a swoosh behind me, I slammed the door and laid holding the kids until daybreak. I received a call from my sister later that morning, and she couldn't understand how we would have been able to stay in that house. When I asked her why, she told me that when she was there grabbing some boxes of pictures, she heard noises coming from my daughter's room upstairs. She said that it was loud and she just felt like an evil presence, and everything inside of her just told her to leave, so she did. She also told me that my son-in-law, for which I had no knowledge of at the time, was practicing some black magic and summoning dark energy in that room, which obviously was not cool. Late that afternoon, when everything was done, the kids were in the car and the car was packed, I just wanted to look at my mother's bedroom one last time where she used to sleep. These walls held just so many memories. I felt like if I looked hard enough to, I would see her laying where the bed had been, and in my mind telling me just not to cry. But as I stood there in the doorway, a chill just went up my spine, and the hairs on the back of my neck and my arms started to raise, and I could feel something closing in on me. And then, and I'll never forget this as long as I live, in my ear, I felt a warm breath and heard one loud word, and it said, "Run." And boy, did I run out of that house so fast, not even bothering to lock the door. And to top it all off, as we were driving off, my granddaughter asked me who that was standing in the window upstairs. The desert is a scary place for me now. It used to be a place filled with peace and serenity, but since living out there for almost 30 years, you see things. This occurrence took place in the high desert of California in the mid-90s. The whole town was once all military. There's a military plant there and a prison. The streets to this day consist of numbers and letters. An example would be Avenue O with 178th Street. You always heard noises of people missing and underground tunnels, which are confirmed here. In fact, a friend of mine kept getting a draft coming from his closet in his childhood home. And later, after he grew up, he checked it out and found an opening to one of these such tunnels. He actually called me over to check it out, but I was too freaked out to go more than 10 feet in when I turned around and just told him that this might be how people disappear. You always saw things late at night off in the distance, far past the lights of that then small town. Strange glowing lights that shot straight up, and things in the sky, just stuff you never talked about, really. But life was carefree back then. If you wanted to visit friends, though, you would have to drive down long desert roads and sometimes end up coming home late at night in the pitch black because there were no streetlights. I remember coming home late one night with my boyfriend at the time and another friend, and we pulled over for some reason. I don't know why, but something just compelled me to get out of the car and look up at the stars. We were in the middle of nowhere, but we could hear what sounded like machinery and muffled clanks, like from metal or something. We all started looking around, but we just didn't see anything. But just then, we felt a vibration under our feet. I crouched down on the street and put my ear to the ground, and it was coming from under us. We all listened intently and heard far down voices, but couldn't make out what was being said. We all stood up and were discussing what it might have been when we saw a small red light on the horizon, and it was getting closer. We piled into the car, and at that point, we just got out of Dodge. But we only told a few friends, and they experienced the same thing, which was weird. A year later, I told a friend that I had started a small hauling business, but there was a big job, so I needed to borrow a trailer. And he said that he had a few that I could use, so I should come out to his property and check them out. It was just starting to get dark when we pulled out this new toy. It was military-grade night vision binoculars, and he told me to wait until it got dark to leave because he wanted to show me something creepy. And I was all in. So later, we walked to the back of his property, looking out at pretty much nothing. No lights, no roads, nothing but barren desert. He pointed the binoculars east, and oh my, there were people out there coming out of the ground and moving around. I said, "What the hell am I looking at?" And he told me that his family called them ground dwellers, and they're located in various parts of the desert. It honestly gave me the heebie-jeebies, and needless to say, I never went to his house after dark again after that. Now, at one point, we were living in a mobile home park past Avenue F. There was a huge treehouse in my yard left by the former renter, and the only way to get up into it was a hole that was cut into the tree with a door on it. Under that was a rope ladder, and one night I was sitting on the porch just drinking a cup of tea when I heard something move up the treehouse and then a head pop up. It was a lady and her husband hiding. Clearly, I thought that they were on drugs, and I told them to come down from there, but they didn't want to. It wasn't until I threatened to call the authorities did they cautiously comply, looking all around, not wanting to be seen. By now, there was a small group of my friends and nosy neighbors gathered around. I saw that she was terrified by something, though, so I asked them to come in, and I made them something to eat and waited for her to calm down. She pulled out these papers, looked like legal documents with government letterheads or something. Some of them had embossed seals, and they had smoke damage with a few of them even burnt on the edges. She told me that they were checking out this place off of Barrel Springs Road. There were 2 or 3 cinder block structures there, and I knew them well. A few years back, I happened upon that place, and a black truck rushed down to greet me with guns drawn. She said that the same thing happened to her, but she was in one of the structures, so she grabbed some things, and her and her husband just ran. I went over these pages and felt really uneasy reading them, like this was stuff people get killed over if it got out. Stupidly, I said, "Why don't you just simply give them back?" She said that they'd been running, and everywhere they stop, a black car or van with government plates show up and sit there just watching them. Well, I really didn't want to get involved with this, especially after reading what I did. It was too big for little old me, and I'll take what I saw to my death, so I packed them a lunch and told them that they could sleep in the treehouse for the night. And they did, but they were gone early the next morning. After that, too, we started seeing black vans parked in our lonely road facing the house. At one point, I was so fed up of seeing them that I just went up to one, but they took off as I knocked on their blacked-out driver's window. The things kept happening out there in the desert, too, but you don't see much now. I think that this is probably because there's more lights and people now. Towns and cameras and phones pointing everywhere, too. But there weren't cell phones back then to call for help and video and whatnot. Anyway, on another day, we were having a bit of fun.
What the fuck? Fuck is schon Oh, here we go. Near that. Hi. עדיין? איך זה הגיוני? זה לא מעבר. נו לא. מה קרה לאיכות? מה יש לאיכות? איך היא יכולה להידרדר? What the fuck? רגע. איך עכשיו? עדיין ג'ופיטר? יותר קרוב. אוקיי, that makes sense. כל האנשים שיכלו לשכוח, לא חשבתי שאתה תשכח. נית אותה כל כך הרבה פעמים.
Guys,
מה שעשית ייט. Can I have this stream? ביוטיוב אתה עושה? וואו. איזה פינוקי. יש לך, איך קוראים לזה? את זה שאצלך מהקירות כן, סילברפיש. אתה לא צריך סילברפיש? אנדרמן? אתה צריך גם בלוקים שהם לא יכולים לעשות להם ספון. הוא בנה גלס נראה לי. אני חושב שהם יכולים לעשות ספון על גלס. קרבט זה לא אבל סרטן לבנות את הכל? הבנתי. אני שומע את עצמי מדבר לעצמי, זה מוזר. כן, ביטלת כאילו את המיק בזה. The fuck? עשית שזה יראה לך את המספרים בביינדים? בקוויק סלוט? איך עושים את החרא הזה? זה טקסט שופינג? בואו נראה. ג'יזוס, הכנת הרבה קרפט. כן, בסדר. ג'יזוס, אתה ממש 68? efficiency 2 זה garbage, לא? לפחות יש לך הרבה רמות. צ'אנלינג? תזכיר לי מה זה? זה מגניב. אם לא... לא, enchantment... זה פישינג רוד. כן. מה? איזה פופו? אשכרה לור יש לו רמה 3. יש לך לא מעט דיימנדס, שפה. חתולים שלך כן. משהו? מה לקחת? שיט. שיט. טוב, עכשיו יש לך שתי פיקיקסים עם סילק טאץ'. לך לגריינדסטון. You need to grind it. פאק. כן. תעשה לך איזה נדרייט. אין לך בכלל, נגמר לך הכל? חסר לך עוד אחד. פייר אספקט, תזכיר לי. פשוט מדליק את המובים. אז עכשיו אתה יכול לחבר את הפיקקס. רגע, אבל אתה לא יכול לשים את זה לפיקקס הזה, אתה יכול לשים אותו על זה עם הסילקטאץ' שלו. נכון. כן, נכון. כן. בוא'נה. פירסינג, כן, זה אייבי. וואו. לא, נראה לי שזה אחד מהשתיים. 38 או 39 רמות הלכו מהר. שם את המנדינג על הכל. מנדינג on you, מנדינג on you, מנדינג on you. גריינד למנדינג. זה מוזר לי, אתה נמצא במצב שיש לך יותר מדי כוח. You know what they say, Ron? With great power comes great responsibility. אני אוהב את הסדר שיש לך בצ'סטים. את מה, את ה... את מה? כן, להרים עם צ'סט. כפרצ'קה. תפנק את האנדר צ'סט עוד יותר. תהפוך את הפיקקס לאנדרייט. לא אין, תשיג טיפה. לא, אין יודע. תכלס כן. מתי עשית סייף פעם אחרונה? תעשה סייף. אקווה? אתה צריך מים בשביל להכין את המפל שאתה עושה בדרך כלל, לא? נדר... לא. אנדר... כן, אמרת אנדר מים. פיפי-פופו? לא ראיתי. וואו, זה עושה באפר בדיוק כשאתה רושם את השם. ג'ף. ג'ף. Your name ג'ף. כמה ביטרית שמת פה? נראה דווקא סבבה סתם. נראה חמוד. וואו, you lazy fuck. השארת את זה בסימפל, אמרת פאק את, יש לך ביטרית, תעשה מה שבא לך. טוב, לא נראה הכי גרוע בעולם. אני חושב... לא. לא נראה לי very fast, הגיוני? כן, יכול להיות. כי אחר כך יש שתי רמות מעל, יש אולטרה פסט, זה הכי גבוה. מה יש לפניו? מגה פסט? למרות שלא נראה לי. You're getting your mega fast internet connection right now. סופר פסט, ואז אולטרה פסט. You're getting your ultra fast internet connection now. סייב, רון, תחזור. עשית סייב? היום זה, בפעם הראשונה הלכתי עם המשפחה שלי איך קוראים לזה? לבסחר שבכפר, המקום הזה קטלני. כן. המשפחה שלי קיבלו כזה, קיבלו חום, ראו את המחירים של הסטייקים, כזה נני דפק. דווקא אבל קבבים, קציצות וכל זה די סבבה במחיר. כן. מה שיקר זה הסטייקים, אבל זה הגיוני, הסטייקים שם וואי. איזה איכות, יא וואדי אחי, יואו. קניתי את איך קוראים לזה? זה היה עגל מקומי, מיושן, צעיר, משהו כזה. זה לא היה פריים, זה היה אנטריקוט, אבל לא היה פריים, אבל זה היה מיושן איזה 30 ומשהו יום, היה קטלני. 200 פאקינג שקל. כן, אני גם לא. זה, קנינו גם את הנקניקיות מרגז החריפות האלה, אני התלהבתי. לקחנו את אני שכחתי איזה קציצות זה נקרא, זה היה קבב משהו. קושיקו? קושיקו? שישקו. כן, הוא היה סגור. כן, הוא אחלה. כן, זה בדיוק, זה אחלה. מה עוד? לקחנו עוד משהו נראה לי. לא, זה לא משם בעצם. מה עוד עשיתי? לא זוכר. אה, קנינו מיונז שום ולא השתמשנו. כבר סמק. מיונז. בוריס פוינט בי פראוד. לקנות מיונז ולא להשתמש. בוא נחשוב מיונז. זה נשמע גרוע. רום, can I get your mayonnaise? Can I offer you some mayonnaise? This is not your mayonnaise, it is our mayonnaise. Mm. רגע, לא הבנתי מה אמרת שעשית טעות. אתה עושה את זה התחלתי כאילו? Mm. ממליץ לך לעשות סייב, כאילו, היה עדיף לעשות לפני. יאיט. רגע, זה גם פייר אספקט, גם נוקבק פה, נכון? פייר אספקט חמוד, לא? Mm. Mm. זה כן, זה בדיוק. כן, בדיוק, זה מביא לו כזה, היי, you can hit me now. וגם אכלתי למשפחה שלי את הפאקינג שכל. לא, סירבתי להדליק את המנגל גז המסריח ההוא. פאקינג הלכתי, קניתי מנגל כזה באיזה 20 שקל, פחמים, יותר טוב. עדיף, זה משהו. התגעגעתי לפחם, ליהודים טובים כאלה על המנגל. נמאס לך? טעם שזה מביא לבשר זה כזה כיפי. אני מסכים איתך שזה הרבה כאב ראש, אבל כן. רגע, מה? אז מה הם עושים? חכם. אז רגע, איך הם יכולים לא, אבל יש כאלה שנתקעים בתוך גאפ כלשהו, לא? אז רגע, אז הם לא יכולים לעוף אחריך אם אתה קופץ מעל משהו? הבנתי. אז למה, רגע, אז למה אני זכרתי שיש אנדרמנים שראיתי נתקעים בתוך בלוקים? אמ, פשוט באג עם הקוליז'ן שלהם? אין לך קול באנדר צ'סט? באנדר צ'סט? מה זה? אמ. נכון, כי צריך לשים את זה... אמ. רגע, אין דרך לשבור את זה חוץ מעם טורץ'? אה, אמ. אפשר להוריד את כל הבלוקים? למלות? או, אוקיי, זה כן צריך. כן. מהמם. מתקמצנים. בטוח שלא הכנסת לאנדר צ'סט? אוי לא, how to basic העלה chicken enchiladas. That's not gonna end well. כשמכין משהו עם תרנגולת זה נגמר טוב. אוי לא. איפה עשית את הסימולציה הזאת? הבנתי. Oh God. אין לך כסף. לזה ספציפית אין לך כסף. למה, כמה, איך, מה, מו. 8 מאווררים. 8 מאווררים. 8 מאווררים. Jesus fucking Christ. אוי רום. מאוד בסיסי. איזה קיט? אז אני רואה. הוא קיצון? 1,000 שקל? חמוד. כן. רגע, hold up. זה יוצא כן, זה יוצא 500 שקל לפאקינג 16 ג'יגה. חמוד. וסטיל 17, טוב. דאם. טיימינגים הרבה יותר, זה טיימינג יותר טוב משלי, פלוס ספיד יותר טוב. בייבי. כן. וואו, חכית. אתה הולך על אינטל? או שזה סימולציה עד ש-AMD יוציאו משהו? הבנתי. מה יש עם KSP? למה הם לא מביאים את ה-10900K? כן, אני יודע. הם יעיפו גם את ה-9900KS. יש להם את ה-9900K הרגיל עדיין, נכון? אני לא בטוח כבר. Hmm. Hmm. רגע, אין להם את ה-XPG ה-4 טראבייט הזה? יש להם את ה-1 טרה שלהם, לא? Hmm. יש להם 2 טראבייט שלו. כן, העסק שלהם פה. כן, מוזר. כן, 1160 שקל. 991 בלט. כן, יש לך SSD. you need that. כרטיס מסך. טוב, זה טוב ששמת את ה-advanced או whatever, זה הגרסה הכי בין היקרות, אז ככה זה יעלה בערך. מעניין אותי איך הם ישימו את האדפטר הזה שהביאו לנו, ל-PSU. כן, השאלה זה איך הוא עובד, מעניין אותי. כי ראיתי שהוא קטן יותר מבחינת כן, הבנתי. אוקיי, טוב, אז כן, adapt, overcome, לא, איך זה הולך? משהו, אני לא זוכר את ההתחלה. improve, כן, adapt, overcome, יפ, thank you. אני מצביע על ה-SX 8200 פרו. Yes, I improved that. Hmm. יש להם את ה-SX 8200 פרו כבר הרבה זמן, אני לא... זה ADATA XPG, זה גם וגם רשום. זה גם וגם בשם. יש את השתיים. הוא 1190. שים ADATA. הנה, שתי טרה. זה השני. זה אחר. רגע, שים ADATA, תעיף את ה-XPG, שים ADATA, אבל איזה פילטר אחר. נסה שנייה. אני רואה את ה-1 טרה. כן, אמרתי, זה משהו ריטרדד. יפ. רואה? QLC זה פופופה. פופופה. מה? רוטר, כן. כן, לפלונטר יש את ה-1040G הרוטר, לא? אתה יכול לראות 17%, לא בעיה. איזה יפה הירידה הזאתי. כן, בדיוק. זה רגע, אני גם איתך בכרטיס של מסך, אל תשכח. אוי אוי אוי. וואו. אני מקווה שלא נדפוק אותו יותר מדי שם, המסכן, הוא נכנס ל-KSP כזה. סליחה אדוני, אתה יודע שיש כאן קנייה בשווי... אדוני, זה 15,000 שקל. כן, אני יודע. אולי... לא, אני אומר כזה, רק כרטיס המסך פלוס ספק, זה זהו 15-16. כרטיס המסך זה איזה 7,000 כל אחד, בספק אני משער שזה 2,000. יופי, תקנה גם את כל הפאקינג חלקים. וואי, איזה קנייה הזויה, זה יהיה 20 ומשהו אלף אם תעשה שתי כרטיסים פלוס את כל המפרט הזה. למה אני רוצה לראות קבלה כזאתי? אני ארגיש כאילו אנחנו בביזנס, מה זה חרא הזה? אני רואה תמים, תודה רבה לך. upgrades people, upgrades. יאללה, אתה מתחיל לבנות? אתה בובו בנאי? לא. יש לו 30 חברים איתו? בנאים. Oh, no space for you. כזה, אתה לא מסתכל למי שנייה בום, אתה עף מהמים. קשטייס. כן, respiration מטורף. כן, enough. ככה עשית את זה בדרך כלל, לא? תמיד היית עושה את החוות ככה, לא? אולי תעשה לך איזה משהו עם סולסנד? זה לא יותר מדי גבוה בשבילו, זה עדיין ירים אותך מספיק. הסולסנד עם המגמה בלוק? אין לו רעיון שלו, איזי. זה תכין מעלית יפה כזאת. אוקיי. אני חושב שעשינו את זה ביחד, כן. מה 5,000 בלוק? לא זכרתי משהו כזה, זה מוזר. What the fuck? מה הסיכוי שתצליח לעשות את זה בלי לקבל ייט מהדרקון? כמה בלוקים אתה מנסה להתרחק? אז בעיקרון עד שהצ'אנק מפסיק להתרנדר. אתה יודע, אתה יכול לחסוך לעצמך ולהוריד פשוט את הכמות צ'אנקים. הבנתי. כן, היא נראית כמו עיגול כזה, או יותר נכון בלוק קובייה. כן.
Fun. Some friends and I were in this stupid little red car called a Yugo that seemed to be on its last legs most of the time. And my friend's
עדיף
uncle had
לשים
told
קליפ
him that
בפוסטה
it was a whole
בזה
abandoned...
דיסקורד. לא דיליי, זה פשוט אני לא רוצה להוריד את המיוט לסטרים כי אני לא רוצה לשמוע את עצמי.
G'day mates, it's B-Buster here.
תדעו.
I would like to give Private Internet Access, or PIA, a shout out
Okay.
for sponsoring this episode. So, most people underestimate the importance of protecting your digital...
Well, fuck.
My mother was a single, lived in the back. I finally found my mother and I asked her what was going on. She told me that she got a really good deal. That G'day mates, it's B-Buster here. I would like to give Private Internet Access, or PIA, a shout out for sponsoring this episode. I was awake and must have switched the alarms off or something, but I swear that I did hear the alarms last night. Anyway, continuing on with the rest of the cases, the scratches and the sneezes continued. To my surprise, I didn't experience any sleep paralysis in this time, which, again, was strange, but we didn't hear anything from my granny. The police didn't put much evidence into her case, though, since Midori was just an old woman. I knew that she was really religious and prayed for me and my brother regularly. I'm not religious at all, and honestly, I didn't believe in ghosts before this incident. But I think the paranormal activity in my room just got a lot worse because my grandmother wasn't able to pray for us anymore or something. It's just a thought. I can't be sure, but I speculate that might be the reason. So once, I didn't go to the toilet before sleeping one night, and this caused me to wake up at around 2 a.m. busting to go to the toilet. When I got back, I wanted to go back to sleep again, but this night I heard 2 knocks coming from my closet. Like, it was 100% in my room, and it would have sounded muffled and dulled, and I knew this too because I heard my flatmate next room moving in, talking in her room, drying her hair, etc. So I just tried to ignore it, and turned around in my bed so I didn't have to face the closet anymore. But then, again, I heard the knocking. This time there was 3 of them, and it was much more aggressive. I stood up at this and opened the closet, but as I expected, there was nothing there. Now, I want to talk about my 2 friends as well, which know every single detail about what's happened to me. I have contact to these 2 on a daily basis, but since I started telling them about my experiences, creepy stuff has started to happen at their place too. So my friend A told me that their house bell just sometimes ringed on the evening when she was around. On one occasion, the ring would stop for like 30 minutes. They got it off and changed the batteries, plugged it in somewhere else, but
you need to save.
would still hear the ring just randomly. My friend B actually started experiencing stuff as well. His computer would just start in the middle of the night. Not by we. The ventilation in the bathroom would go on by itself, even though you have to actually switch it on by hand since it's an old house, and the cats would just go crazy every evening. I have to say that I can't guarantee that the story from friend A is true because I know it sounds a little bit weird, but I can guarantee that I witnessed a few things at B's house when I was around. So anyway, right now I'm moving out of the flat since I finished my apprenticeship this August. I got the keys to my new apartment yesterday and I started packing things up in my room right now. There were a lot of boxes and things stored under my bed. Everything was super dusty. So, step by step, I got everything out of there, and I was at the point where almost everything was out, except the last few boxes and a scrap of paper. I got the paper and noticed that it was a photograph of a boy. It was very wrinkled, and it smelled a bit like smoke. I knew that it smelled like house fire almost instantly because my ex-boyfriend's house actually burned down, and they still saved some of their family pictures, and they smelled exactly the same way. I noticed the smell immediately on this photo, and I started crying and called both friend A and B. Like, I was shaking pretty badly, and I felt really unsafe being in my room by myself. Like, why was all this bullcrap happening to me? I mean, who was this boy in this photo, and where did this photo even come from? I investigated the picture further, though, and it was tattered on all sides. The paper was fully printed on one side, and on the other, there was a handprint. And it was a really tiny handprint. Child. Along the handprint, there were brown burnt parts. Upon seeing this too, I wanted to get it out of my room, but I couldn't throw it away since friend A wanted to see it the next day, which was going to be today. So I went downstairs and I placed it on the kitchen table, since I knew that I'll walk past it the next morning to get my lunch, and then I would see it and it would remind me. Also, just to note this as well, it couldn't have been from my previous tenant, since my room was completely empty when I moved in. A month ago, I completely rearranged the furniture in my room as well, and I threw everything away that I didn't need anymore, and I cleaned the whole thing up, and I can assure you that this picture was not there. So, the rest of the evening felt really unpeaceful as well. I was pretty scared, and I had a bad feeling about every room in my house. Just bad vibes everywhere.
If you guys want to speak?
I took a shower, and I remembered that I still had to close the balcony door because it was going to rain later on. So I went downstairs, and shortly before I could reach the floor downstairs, I heard steps and something which sounded like a keyring, I guess. You know how when two keys or more come together and they make like a jingling noise? My first thought, though, was that it must have been one of my roommates. From the stairs, you couldn't actually look into the kitchen, so I didn't know for sure, but it sure sounded like them, and I was 10,000% sure that somebody was there. Like, the sound was in this apartment, it was a few meters away from me, and it was like it was in the kitchen. I was sure that it was one of my flatmates that was down there. So I turned around and was about to go to my room again, since I didn't feel like talking to somebody at that moment. But before I made a step back up, I thought that I should say hi, because if I didn't, I would just have to come back down anyway again and say hi. So, I could just say hi now and avoid further conversation later. So I turned around again and I went to the kitchen. And it really messed with me when I saw that nobody, absolutely nobody, was down there. The windows were closed, the door was shut, and at this, I ran upstairs immediately and locked myself in my room. The furniture seemed to creak louder and more intense that evening as well. I don't know if that was just adrenaline rushing through me or if there was something going on, but it was strange nonetheless. After my hysteria, though, I did manage to fall asleep, surprisingly fast as well. But when I woke up, it honestly felt like I just hadn't slept at all. I think it was because regularly I woke up that night, having sort of mini panic attacks. The kind of thing that happens when you have a bad nightmare about falling and you just kind of are shook awake. But the strange thing is that I didn't really dream at all that night. But I still woke up multiple times with heavy beating hearts and shaking and sweating and just gasping for air. I can recall that this happened a few times that night as well, and I can recall after that I woke up and I walked aimlessly around my room for a few minutes, I think. I know that I did that as well, but I really can't remember why. And at this point, I'm actually a little bit afraid of myself. But anyway, like I said, the next morning I woke up with the feeling like I hadn't slept at all. Every bone and muscle was just aching, and I barely could open my eyes. When I got ready, I went downstairs to get my lunch, but I remembered the picture, and you probably guessed it, but it just wasn't there anymore. I don't believe that my flatmates took it too, because they always leave things lying around for weeks. Letters, food, dishes, and practically everything. So I'm pretty sure that it wasn't them. Plus, they would have asked me about it, I think. But the thing is that I didn't look at the table yesterday when I went into the kitchen and heard the footsteps, so I can't tell if this thing took it or not. Anyway, this whole experience has just been a roller coaster, and I know it's really weird. My grandma is still missing, and people are still looking for her, so there's that going on. I'm sorry for just how jumbled all this is and how crazy it sounds. I know, trust me, I know. But I thought that it was worth telling someone about this. I'll be moving out in a week, and I don't know if this thing is going to follow me or not, so I would really, really appreciate if somebody would help me. I work as a caretaker for a school building. Because my building is small, we only have 2 people there. One person works at 6 a.m. to 2:48 p.m., and the second works from 2:42 p.m. to 11 p.m. Sometimes there are people renting out the gym there, but after 10:30 they're always gone. And last night there was nobody there, so I'd been alone since the daycare left at 6 p.m. Around 7:30 I had walked around the building's interior and checked that every window was shut, every door was locked, and there were no teachers still working in the building, so I knew I was 100% alone. Around 11, I was finishing up my shift. Our exit is a door in our storage room, and there's an alarm panel right by the door so we can set the alarm, and the door leads right out to the parking lot. Now, right outside the storage room is a set of double doors that also lead outside. They are typically used by staff, and as I waited for it to hit 11, I heard movement and men's voices outside. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but I decided I'd listen for them to leave and get on the phone with a friend while I walked out to my car. But suddenly, at the double doors beside the storage room, I heard someone start pulling and pushing at the door, trying to get it open. After a bit of that, I heard, "I guess she's not here." Keep in mind, this is a male-dominated field, so if they didn't know who was working, they would have assumed that it was a he. I called my supervisor to check if there was a legitimate reason why someone might be trying to get in, and it wasn't, then stayed on the phone with him until I got to my car safely. Now, there are some security cameras, but only the principal can access them. So the next day, we looked at them, and it was even creepier than I'd expected. There were two men, late teens, early 20s, and they came in from the car park behind the building, walk up the side, directly to the doors, try them, stand there for a second, and then walk back the way that they come.
Hello.
It was really weird, but my gut tells me that they may have been watching me for some time out there. This happened about 4 years ago, back when I was a lot younger and desperate for money. It was a Friday, and my girlfriend and I wanted to go to the local casino with one of our friends, just to have some drinks and lose a bit of cash on the slots. It was a cheaper alternative to going out and drinking, since you could just spend $10 and drink for free the whole night, as long as you just keep playing the slots. So we got there at around 6 p.m, my girlfriend and her friend dressed in their best, and me just kind of slapped together into something a bit better than just woke up. I was the only male in the group, and while I was quite slender at the time, I also had a full beard and a shaven head, so it would have been pretty difficult to mistake me for a female. We played the slots until about midnight, taking full advantage of the free drinks, and I was the designated driver, so I just drank Coke the entire night while my girlfriend and her friend got absolutely wasted. Once the last of the money that we brought with us,
Getting wasted is the
we decided to just
most fun
call
you
it
can do,
quits and
you
go
know?
home. The parking lot is on the further side of the
If you don't
casino,
get
and we were parked on the third floor.
Seriously?
The casino's
Come and
parking
say,
lot was
"Yes,
4 stories high, and you could either take the stairs on the left
Oh,
or up
okay.
an elevator on the right. On each floor,
Look
there
at
was
the
a massive
Zama.
sliding door that led to the
Yeah,
parking
get
lot
it,
once
it's
you
like
got up
you
there. As we made our way towards the stairwell, though, some chubby guy in a trench coat stepped up to me, clearly drunk, and put his arm around my shoulder.
אין לך מים עליך.
I'm quite a
לא, אתה
friendly
לא
person,
משתגע, נכון?
so I just kind of stood there and waited to see what this person wanted before I just shrugged him off. He had greasy, curly black
אוקיי,
hair,
יופי, תשמור לפני
and I
עדיף.
remember his breath just smelled like cigarettes. My girlfriend and her friend just kind of hanged back, silently laughing at me, since this kind of thing happens often to me. For some reason, drunk people just really like me. He leaned in closer to me and told me that
אז רגע, כן
he just won
משתגעים?
big and couldn't remember where he parked his car. He pulled out a big wad of cash from his pocket and told me that if I could help him find his car, that he'll give me $1,000. I was absolutely floored, since that was the most cash that I'd ever seen in my life. And so I agreed to it immediately. We walked towards the parking lot together, his arm still around my shoulder and his weight leaned onto me.
בערך.
My plan was to search the first floor with his car keys and go up to the next level if we don't find it. He had his arm around me the whole time as we made our way to the entrance of the lot, my girlfriend and her friend going towards the stairs as me and the guy walked towards the entrance to level 1. The whole time he was just talking really loudly to me, his words slurring as he stumbled around the place. But
כשאתה חוזר
when
לדבר
my
על
girlfriend and her
טלפון,
friend ducked out of sight, he tightened his grip around my neck, looked me in the eyes, and said, $1,000 for finding my car and anal. He tightened his grip even further and tried to grab my arm, not slurring any of those words. I was stunned for a second as he started pulling me towards the elevator, his hand still trying to grab for my arm. Luckily, I used to do MMA for a few years when I was younger, so I knew how to get out of a grapple, and those long hours of training kicked in. I slipped my head out from his arm and pulled myself free before he could tighten his grip further. He frantically tried to grab me again, his fingernails racking across the skin of my arm as I pulled it back from him and took a few steps away. And immediately, he stood up straight and hurriedly walked through the door to level 1, his drunken stumble completely gone as he ducked out of sight. I ran back to my friends in the stairwell, who saw the entire thing, and were laughing their heads off thinking about how funny the whole situation was. When they saw that he left deep scratches on my arm when I broke free, though, they realized just how serious the situation was. It's scary to think that they would have probably just stood there and watched me get taken, thinking that it was just some drunk guy messing with me. So I saw this about 4 years ago at work, and it really creeped me the hell out. I work for a digital surveillance company that runs the eye in the sky for thousands of restaurants, bars, and gas stations across the US. And from time to time, we get calls for investigations to look into robberies and theft, etc. So one day, we get a call from a popular fast food chain located in the heart of Detroit. They say an employee OD'd by the dumpster, and they needed us to get some answers on the situation. First, basically, what happened and how long he was there. But the next question is where it starts to get weird. You see, the dumpsters had a brick wall around it. It had 2 entrances to the dumpster, a gate that you had to pass when you walked out the back door, and the big gates where the garbage truck has access to the dumpster to empty it out. They claimed that those big gates were always open, and the small gate by the back door was locked from the inside. Nobody ever used that smaller gate, but the weird thing was that when the body was found, an employee walked out, and that gate that was never open was indeed open, and the body was sitting there on full display. So their question was, who the hell opened that gate? So we downloaded the footage. Now, one night, the employee goes outside, throws out the trash, and you can kind of see him through the locked gate that was It was see-through, but very difficult to actually see, though. The way the camera was angled, you could just kind of see over the top also. And he injects himself, slumps over, and keels over dead behind the dumpster. He was out there for 2.5 days. No employees ever come to look for him. It's pouring rain both days, and for 2 days, employees come and go taking out the trash and not seeing him. But then, on the 3rd day in the morning sunshine, clear as day, the gate just slowly opens by itself. Nobody comes, nobody goes. The gate just opens by itself, and the body is there in the same position it was 2.5 days earlier. I literally felt chills down my spine when I saw this too, and to this day I just simply cannot explain it without thinking that it was actually paranormal. Anyway, a couple of hours later, an employee walks out with the trash bag, sees the body, freaks out, and calls the cops. I didn't write it, but we basically had to write a report on how a gate apparently just opened itself. Last Thanksgiving, I was driving home from college with my friend, both 21 and female at the time. I live in a very isolated part of Arkansas that requires driving through an hour of hairpin turns in the mountains. There are lots of blind spots, and the whole time you're driving on the edge of just huge drop-offs with no barriers. I'm usually pretty confident driving through the mountains, but we were in my friend's car, so I was going slower than usual, driving about 5 minutes speed. So, almost as soon as we started the roughest part of the drive, another car was tailgating us pretty close. This was stressing me out, and as soon as I saw somewhere that I could pull over, I did. I pulled into a church parking lot, and my friend offered to drive the rest of the way, but I declined as it was completely dark and she had never driven this route before. We got back on our way, though, and a few minutes later, I have to come to a screeching halt as there's a car stopped in the middle of the road. It wasn't on the shoulder at all, but just stopped dead in the middle of the road. My friend is saying that they must have broken down, but can't call a tow because there's no service in this area. I, on the other hand, immediately have a bad feeling and lock the doors. I tell my friend to stay in the car no matter what, as she's starting to get scared at this point and points out that she thinks it was the car that was following us. I can't tell, but I'm pretty scared at this point. It's parked right before a hairpin turn too, so I can't pass it. My friend starts frantically telling me to go ahead and pass it, but I don't want to get hit by a Mack truck or fall off the mountain or something. So I honk my horn. Nothing happens. No chance of calling for help as there's no cell service, like I said, so we just wait there for a while, doing nothing. My friend is crying and freaking out, but I'm too scared to try and pass them. I honk a couple of times, and eventually a guy gets out of the car, comes around back, and leans against his car, just staring at us. My friend is freaking out even more, and I'm just frozen. I tell her not to make eye contact. I'm ready to floor it if he does something, but he just stands there, staring. Mind you, he's not checking his car or anything either. I try to stay calm and just pray that another car will come along soon. This goes on for what seems like forever, but was probably 15 plus minutes. He's just casually leaning against his car, just looking at us. Eventually we see car lights in our rear view, and then the guy jogs to his door and gets back in his car. He speeds off, going dangerously fast. So there was obviously nothing wrong with his car. I start driving, not wanting to cause a wreck. We don't see anything else for a while, but we pass the same car parked along the highway a while later, and it pulls back on and starts tailing us again. I try to speed up and get rid of him, but he just keeps following us. We have cell service at this point, but I don't know if we should call the cops because, well, nothing really happens. I call home and I tell my brothers what's going on and tell them to wait on the porch for us. And the car follows me all the way home, down the really long drive to my house as well. I get to my house and my two brothers are waiting on the porch holding their deer rifles. I pull in and the car just goes to the end of the drive, loops around, and speeds off back the way it came. We tried to catch its plates, but we just couldn't make them out in the dark like that. Needless to say, me and my friend were really freaked out, but when I told other friends the whole story, they just didn't think it was a big deal. What do you guys think happened that night?
You got raped. She got raped.
This happened a few years ago when
With
I was
30
maybe
guys.
15 or 16.
Did you?
I used to not have blinds or curtains on my windows, and I never bothered to get something to cover them up for a long time.
Boy, ladness.
My street is fairly rural, and we know all of our neighbors fairly well, so I was never really worried about something weird happening.
Is
That
it Strike Battle
until
Royale?
this night. It was sometime in the winter. I've always been a bit of a night owl, so
Jesus
I was
fucking
up late on
Christ.
my computer.
ما زي 25
I had the
دقيقة.
light in my room on, but it was pitch black outside, so I couldn't see anything out the window. It was completely silent
Really?
in my house when I heard it.
What the fuck?
Three loud bangs on my window.
Dat gaat voor de
It
optie.
scared me so bad that I fell off my bed and I stayed down there for a while. Eventually, I convinced
Wow.
myself that it must have been some kind of an
Shit.
animal, like a bat or something,
Because the oi.
that just flew
Shit,
into my
it's
window. I calmed myself down and I went back to whatever the hell I was
Oh,
doing.
peepeepoopoo.
And I didn't really think much of it after that. I just never bothered to mention it to anyone until a few nights later around the same time.
תחשוב על איזה קרב
I had my
יש
window
לפאקינג
cracked open,
סימן
still
שם.
no blinds
איזה Battle Royale זה יכול להיות שם.
when I heard leaves crunching outside like somebody
Christ,
was
eh.
walking on them. They stopped right outside of my window, but it was
So
still
I
too
could-
dark
no,
for me
no,
to
this
see
is
what was
my-
out there. At this point, I probably should have screamed for my
Oh,
parents
no,
or
we're going
the
to
police or
לדמיין.
something, because I could just feel someone just
Yeah.
staring directly at me.
היה רואים למטה
I
ששמת.
could feel that they had bad intentions. I was too scared to even move, but I just knew somehow
Wait a minute.
there was
Hold
someone
up.
out there.
Hold up.
So I did the only thing that I could think of at the time.
חפץ את הוויד.
I stared directly into the pitch blackness outside of the window, put on the most
That's
intimidating
good,
face
we're
that I
gonna
could manage, and stayed like that. I must have sat in that position for a good 5 minutes until
Oh,
I
I
heard the
love
footsteps
it.
again, this time leading away from my window. I shut the window and
אל
tucked
תשכח
a
לשים
blanket
לך מספיק
around it
כבל
after I
שתוכל
couldn't hear the
לטפס למעלה.
footsteps anymore, and I barely slept that night. The next day, I bought a pair of blinds and told my mum about the incident when we were at the store. I said to her that I heard footsteps outside my window last night. My mum doesn't get scared or intimidated easily, as she's one of the most fearless people I know, in fact. But as soon as those words left my mouth, she just turned white. She said, "Did you tell your dad about that?" And I told her no, I hadn't told my dad, and asked why she wanted to know. She looked me straight in the eyes and told me just one of the most
כן,
bone-chilling
מצחיק
things
בכלל.
that I've ever heard. "Honey, your dad was talking to our neighbor this morning. She told him that she had seen a man walking around our yard for the past few nights. And last night she saw him walking towards your window, but he disappeared into the dark before she could figure out if it was one of us or not. She said after a few minutes that he left, apparently, but he came back a few hours later and she saw him while getting ready for work. She knew then that it wasn't one of us this time since the sun was coming up, and he also had a knife in his hand.
This is
She
not
went
normal.
outside and screamed for him to
Yes.
leave, but instead of running down the street, he ran into our backyard and then into the woods. I live in a military neighborhood, and all of my neighbors are active duty, which tends to make me feel pretty safe if something were to happen.
Oh,
But
yeah, in the mid zone.
after I just heard that there was a creepy man outside my window in the woods more than once, and that he ran into our
We're in
backyard
the
instead of
community
down the
night watch.
street,
Don't worry.
I don't think any amount of military would make me
What
feel
are you
safe
going
after
to
that.
cut me with? 10 years
The parents
spoiling?
never let me stay over at my boyfriend's house back then, but after that night, she let me stay at my boyfriend's house for almost a week. And when I got back home, my blinds were installed and there was a curtain over the window, and the window lock that was previously broken was now fixed. I haven't unlocked or opened that window since this happened, and we never saw or heard about this guy again. My neighbor never saw anything again, and we just reported the incident, but never heard anything about it after that. I don't know who he was or what he looked like, but I sure hope that he doesn't come back. I live on an island where most people live
זה
on
נראה
the
כל כך
coast, but
ג'נקי.
my
זה
childhood
נראה
house
כמו
was
פרויקט
down in the
שלנו.
mountains. Imagine a house in the woods, but at the
נראה
very top of the
פרויקט
mountain.
שלנו
if you
שיותר
can.
ג'נקי מזה.
The house is surrounded by thick mist every night, like in the bad horror movies, and the woods around it start less than 2 feet from the outer walls of the house. Our closest neighbor is a 15-minute drive away, and 5 minutes away there's also an abandoned house. I think the house belonged to a distant relative or something, but was abandoned more than 40 years ago. There's no streetlights, and there's all kinds of animals roaming the area. This is important to the story because even though you couldn't see a group of 10 people hiding like 1 meter away from you in the woods, you could hear absolutely everything right up to a couple of kilometers away, in fact. If we saw car lights or heard a car approaching, me and my family would turn off the lights and we would hide. I don't know why, we were just shy and antisocial, you name it. But anyway, I think that's enough to set the story up. I'll add some details along the way that may be important. But my house is small and impoverished, and our family car was a good one. I don't really know much about cars, but my dad always said that without a really good car, we wouldn't be able to go up and down the mountain that we lived in. Also, there's currently 8 people inside of our house around 11 p.m. So, I'm at the dining table just enjoying some cereal while I'm watching some anime. Basically just kind of having the time of my life. The lights to the house were on, so nothing could be seen in the dark outside. There's a window in front of me that gives sight to the front of the entrance of the house and onto the road. And just then, something calls my attention, but I don't hear or see anything. I think that I see a human silhouette outside, but it doesn't move, so I just ignore it as some effect of the lights in the house and my own reflection or something. More anime, more cereal, and I feel something move at the other side of the
You
window.
mean more weeb?
And this time, the silhouette is waving at me. I felt my heart jump out of my chest and I froze. The person outside waves at me as if trying to make sure that nobody else in the house is noticing him. after maybe 10 seconds, in which I'm just looking at him with a spoon halfway to my mouth, he decides to say hello. He then says, "I need help." My parents hear this and they approach the window, which made me sure that I wasn't just looking at a ghost, which was amazing news for me.
How
The
is
man
it amazing?
outside
Someone
starts
is
telling a
looking at
story
you.
about how he got his
When
car
you-
stolen
how
at
to
gunpoint and needs help. My parents are surprised that nobody heard his footsteps or a car or anything, so they whisper their theories amongst themselves. For this mysterious guy's story to be true, he had to be mugged more than a mile away, get his car stolen, and then walk for half an hour in the dark through the woods, following the dim light of our house. It may sound crazy, but my parents decided to actually believe him, and they offer calling the police. But our visitor begs and says the stupidest thing that he could have. He says, "Don't call the police, I don't have a gun." My parents stay silent for a while. The guy outside knows that he's messed up, but proceeds to make his request. He asks, "Can I get a ride downtown?" My dad nervously chuckles and gives him some sort of an excuse. He mentions the time, the fact that he felt the guy was lying and that he had already called the police, which was a lie in fact. And this is when my favorite part of the story begins. I stand up from the table, shaking. I go to a closet, and even though I can't see the guy's face, I know that he's following my actions. I get 2 machetes that are half my size and run to another room. I was terrified, and looking back, I probably took away the only weapons my parents could have used to protect themselves in case of an altercation. But I opened the door to my room where me and my siblings sleep, and they were watching some silly show, probably something stupid like Hannah Montana or iCarly, and their hyena laughter came out. My sisters are really loud, and my younger brothers are 4 years old, 7 years old, and 9 years old, so their laughs are angelical by day and demonic by night. But I signal at them to shut the hell up, and they do so, joining me and my parents in our fear. We sit there in silence as the guy says, "It's okay. If you can't help me, I'll just go to the next house, alright?" My dad says, "There is no next house. You should wait for the police here." "I don't need the police. I'm good." This goes back and forth. The guy is now in good shape apparently to walk an hour down the mountain to reach downtown. My dad offers a rusty metal tricycle from our porch so that he can go downtown as a bit of a joke. And the guy accepts this offer and grabs the tricycle. I assume that he just wanted to leave with something. But this tricycle is like 20 years old and it definitely doesn't work now. We hear the screeching of the tricycle for a couple of seconds as the stranger just struggled to be able to ride it, and then it stopped not too far away from our house. At least, it seemed like he stopped, and we didn't hear any footsteps that indicated the guy had left. And after trying to identify if he was still in sight to no avail, my dad finally calls the police. We wait in silence, looking at the road from the front windows. 15 minutes later, the police get there, which was an amazing time back home, heroic even. And as soon as the red and blue lights show up, they illuminate the entire road up to the abandoned house. The tricycle is still on the road not too far away. The police claim not seeing anybody on the road. There's only one road into the mountain, and if the guy kept on walking, they definitely would have seen him. In town far west from here, there were things just... This experience happened to me when I was 14 years old. I hadn't spoken to anyone about the event since it happened, not even my significant other. But I'm 20 years old now, about to double major with my first 2 degrees in psychology and anthropology. Recently as well, for reasons unknown to me, the memories of this strange happening have resurfaced, and are continuing to plague my waking thoughts, as well as my unconscious and subconscious too. As we are taught in psychology, talking about the situation could help with repressed trauma. So, here it goes. So I live in the high desert mountains of Southern California, situated just below the Nevadas. My town is no booming metropolis by any means. At the time, our largest market was a Kmart. One of the last still in business, I might add. And I think that we only had like 4 stoplights in the whole town. And this takes place in a subsection of the town about 13 miles from the shops, I'd say, banks and restaurants, in a small community larger inhabited by retirees. It's smack dab in the middle of summer, and the temperatures were well into the high 90s to low 100s. My nightly routine would consist of walking my Australian Shepherd, but I would always wait until it was almost dark to avoid the heat. I grabbed my phone, a small pocket knife, some headphones, my pup, and I set out for my nightly walk. My community is also home to a significant amount of equestrian riders, as well as cattle ranchers too. The trails that I walked were designated horse riding trails set between pastures. That night, I had decided to take the horse trail that stretches for approximately 2 miles between back-to-back paddocks. It's basically a long, narrow trail that is between very large backyards. My ending destination was the Equestrian Centre, a communal equestrian park where all types of horse riders could enjoy various activities on their horses. So making my way through the sandy terrain of the trail, it was nearly dark now. The sky was becoming a deeper shade of blue every time that I looked up, and my dog was becoming harder to see as well. I estimated my arrival at the Equestrian Centre to be around 15 minutes from my current position, so I sent a text to my mother and I said, "I'll be at the Equestrian Centre in about 15 minutes, could you meet me up there? I'm too tired to walk back." My mother replied, "Sure, I'll leave in 10 minutes. And at this point, I was just outside the east entrance of the Equestrian Centre, where the Enchanted Forest Trail connects to the straight trail that I was on. Sort of like maybe like a 3-way intersection. You can either go left into the Enchanted Forest Trail or go straight into the Equestrian Centre. But before I reached the intersection of the trails, I noticed a weird shift in my dog's behavior as she became anxious and seemingly worried about something. She had her eyes fixated to the forest and stopped dead in her tracks. I played it off as just another animal within the forest, like a bobcat or a boar, as they weren't uncommon in this area. I gave her a slight tug on her collar, although she was still incessantly focused on the forest. But with a little more convincing, I was able to get her moving forward, pushing towards the Equestrian Centre where my mother would be waiting for our arrival. And now it was nearly pitch black, with only the moon guiding me with its low light, and there was just the slightest of visibility, forcing me to turn on my cell phone's dim flashlight. Entering the Equestrian Centre now, I noticed something that startled me immensely. There was a very tall person, a man about 10 to 15 feet into the Enchanted Forest Trail, with his back towards me, standing completely still, his head facing the sky and his hands open, palms pointing in front of him while his arms are at his side. He was tall, maybe about 6 feet if I had to guess, slim build, short dark hair, was wearing what looked like to be light blue scrubs, or at least a very thin blue napkin-like material, and was also barefoot. But what startled me the most was his demeanor and what he was doing. His stance was enough to scare anyone in that setting, but as I approached him slowly, it appeared to me that he was shaking, vibrating, or slightly convulsing, but doing so while standing. It didn't seem like he had any control over it too, although he remained balanced perfectly. Scared though now, and not entirely sure what to do, I asked him, "Hello? Excuse me?" I paused momentarily and raised my voice slightly with the next question. "Is everything all right, sir?" When I said that, he stopped shaking altogether, but still doesn't turn around or move another muscle. He just remains that same creepy position and doesn't even move. For a brief moment, too, I honestly thought that maybe I was imagining this. But then I glanced down at my dog, and she was also concerned with the state and condition of this man, and also began growling quietly. It was at that point, too, that I knew that this all wasn't in my head. But when I looked back up, he had moved closer to me, about 7 feet closer, in fact, now almost on my trail's path. I had only looked at my dog for a split second, and he did it without even making a sound. He still wasn't facing me either, and his hands were still open, head still facing the sky. But I wasn't about to wait and see what this guy was doing or what his intentions were. So, slowly and steadily, I eased my way past him towards the equestrian centre, as quietly as I could before I felt like I was at a safe enough distance to start sprinting as fast as I could away from this guy. When I finally reached the first arena of the equestrian centre, I sort of looked back into the direction of the forest, completely out of breath now, and there he was. This guy was standing at the edge of the trail outside of the forest, just standing there. But now he was facing me. I was too far away to see his face, and frankly, I just didn't want to. I couldn't make out features. All I could see was his silhouette illuminated by the moonlight, peeking through the forest trail. And I continued to just run with no intention of stopping, until I found someone. And man, I had never been so happy to see my nagging neighbour Penny and her mooding mare, Jolene, riding in the Milano area. She noticed my distress, but due to her already harsh opinions of me, I had told her that I'd been on an endurance run and was just very out of breath and tired. I wanted to avoid any sort of small-town gossip as much as I could, to be honest, but my mother arrived with impeccable timing too, and during the ride home, I just broke down into a state of paranoia, distress, and panic at what I had just witnessed. My mother, my poor mother, didn't know exactly what to make of it, so she recommended that I file a police report with the local PD. About an hour after getting home, an officer shows up to take my statement. Following up the next day, the same officer claims to have went and checked out the area, but didn't find anyone or anything out of the blue, apart from some partial bare footprints. But there's nothing incriminating or suspicious about someone going for a walk without shoes, so he just sort of played it off as a joke and accused me of being under the influence, but I can assure you that I was completely sober. And nothing ever came out of this too. I eventually attended weekly therapy sessions for almost 2 years following this event, and I never went on walks by myself ever again too. I had night terrors about the man, and sometimes I still do. I still don't know what to make of it all, but I'm doubtful that I ever will. When I was in my early 20s and living in Chicago, I really wasn't making much money. But when I found this apartment, it was too good to be true. The top floor of a duplex with 6 rooms for $775 a month. The agent who showed me the apartment stressed to me that the landlords were very religious. I didn't have a problem with that, even if it did sound a little bit ominous. The landlords were an elderly couple that lived downstairs. They seemed okay at first, but then when they saw that I was having my boyfriend over, things started to get really weird. For instance, one day I was in my office writing. I hear a knock at the door. I open it, and it's the old lady from downstairs. But before I can say hello, she says, "Have you ever gotten an abortion?" I shut the door in her face. I mean, no thanks. But this was a colossal mistake. So, the house was laid out kind of weirdly. There was a door at the bottom of a flight of stairs that I thought led to a communal laundry room, but after accidentally opening it once, I discovered it led directly into my landlord's living room. And unfortunately, I learned this one the hard way. I was in my kitchen cooking, my boyfriend was at work, and I was by myself when I heard what sounded like the click of a door. Okay, I say out loud. What the heck was that? I didn't really make the connection that it could have been the door that led into their living room, but I walked into the hallway and I look around. I don't see anyone at the end of the hallway. I poke my head into all of the rooms, but there's nobody there. Then I look down the staircase leading to their house, and the neighbor lady is standing there just staring me down. I screamed. She flinched and stepped back into her apartment and swung the door shut. After that, every time that I left the house, I spent every possible moment out of the house after that incident too. I would come back and something would always be moved. A window would be shut. At once, the shower was dripping and my towel was damp. I couldn't lock the door too because, it was technically a door to their house. They were the only ones with the key anyway. But the knocking got so frequent, 3 or 4 times a day, that me and my boyfriend propped up an old mattress so that we wouldn't have to hear it while we slept. The second to last straw, though, was when I opened the door for work and the stairs were completely gone. I physically couldn't even leave my house because there were literally no stairs there. They had been dismantled and were now sitting on their porch. I called them repeatedly, but they didn't answer. Finally, their son came out of the house and explained that they were remodeling their porch. And then he told me that I had to cut through their apartment downstairs. So I descended the stairs and opened the door, and they were both sitting at their filthy kitchen table just staring at me. The phone was in its cradle. They must have heard it ringing, but they just kept staring at me with this blank look on their faces. I crossed their kitchen as quickly as I could, and I left out their back door. A few days later, I came home from my job and noticed that the bathroom floor was almost completely flooded, like somebody left a faucet on or the shower on or something. The old woman, seeing that I had come home, came upstairs and knocked, screaming at me that I had flooded the bathroom and that her son had to come and fix it. And I was so exhausted by this point that I just told her, what the heck, okay. Her son comes by a few hours later, and he is absolutely off his face on something. I open the door and I tell him that I need at least an hour or so before he comes in, and then he picks something up and swings it at me. It was a huge wrench. I somehow duck out of the way and he stumbles over. I book it down the newly repaired stairs as quickly as possible and call the police. They come by and take down a complaint, but claim that since there was no physical contact, that they can't really do anything. I learn later that the old couple has a daughter on the force. In the middle of the night, me and my boyfriend and several of his friends packed all of our stuff into a Chevy Astro, and we just lived in hotels and a van for a month until we found another house. They never did attempt to contact us again, which, for that, I'm thankful. When I was a teenager, my older brother moved out and my parents both worked late. So, occasionally, I would spend evenings by myself after school. We lived in the countryside, a few miles outside of town, and had a good collection of neighbours. The day just went as normally as ever as well. I went to school, got home, turned on the TV, had a snack, and texted one of my friends who I had a crush on. It wasn't long afterward that I noticed a man outside of my house, and he walked past a few times. He wasn't an ordinary person walking around the block, too. He looked scraggly and sort of unkempt. I ducked as far as I could behind a chair, still trying to see him out of the living room windows, hoping that he didn't see me. But soon, he came to the front door and he knocked. I was texting my friend the entire time, increasingly getting freaked out, obviously. As he knocked on the door, I stupidly went to answer it as well. I had my phone with me with 911 at the ready. I tried to sort of silently unlock the door to not alert the man, and then I opened the door a crack. There was a screen door separating myself and the man. I was ready to slam the door and lock it if anything happened, but the man just sort of looked at me with crazed and paranoid eyes. He had a large dark beard and looked to be maybe in his late 50s or early 60s if I had to guess. He seemed out of breath and his face was just drenched with sweat. He was larger too, more the reason to keep my guard, right? But I sheepishly said hello. "Please, call the police, they're after me," he said in an exhausted smoker voice. He kept looking at the road and tensed whenever a car would occasionally pass. Who's after you?" I asked, getting ready to slam the door. "Listen, I barely escaped. They were right behind me, please. Can I come inside? And at this, I knew to call the police. Just wait here, okay? I'll get someone to help. My heart was completely in my throat at this point. I didn't know if this guy was going to try and force his way into the door, so I quickly shut it and I locked it. I ran to check the back door as well, and locked that as well as I called 911. My heart was racing and I could barely tell the operator my information, but they said that they would send somebody out. It wasn't long too until a patrol car arrived, but it felt like forever, I can tell you. The entire time I kept watching the man who then walked into my driveway, pacing nervously. The officer got out and proceeded to talk with this guy, and they got in the car and they left. I still have no idea what happened to this guy too, nor if he was even telling the truth. He could have been drunk or crazy, but it was genuine fear in his eyes, I think, when I looked at him. Something truly scared this guy, and it scared me to think that there could be someone out there that wanted people for whatever reason, as much as he seemed to be letting on. Anyway, like I said, I really don't know what happened to the guy, but I do wish him all the best. I've lived in Southern California my entire life, pretty much. And if you know anything about California, it's very diverse. Up north is filled with mountains and trees, and the south is a lot more, well, city-like. And this summer, I decided to take a trip to Lake Tahoe. It's a beautiful place, and my first time being upstate. But I'll chop this story up into segments of sorts to make it easy to understand. So day one, I settled into the cabin at around 5 p.m. After an 8-hour drive, I was pretty tired too, so I went and lay down in the bed that was in the loft. It was quiet too. It was like being in a different world. I was so used to cars zooming by and people talking right outside of my house, but here it was quiet. I fell asleep fairly quickly too, but around 4 hours into my sleep, I jerked up from my sleep. I looked around for a bit before hearing a strange tapping noise. I looked around to see where it was coming from, but to no avail. It honestly sounded like somebody was tapping on the window part of the back door, but in the end I just figured that I was being paranoid, and I fell back to sleep. Day 2, nothing happened that day, and I slept fine. Day 3, I woke up early in the morning, maybe 4 o'clock, and I heard a crash coming from the attic ladder that was placed conveniently right behind the couch that I was sleeping on. And I completely froze. And then I heard footsteps. You know that feeling you get when you feel like somebody is staring at you? That's how I felt. I was on my side, staring straight ahead, when suddenly I felt somebody or something crawl over me. I felt their 2 hands on either sides of me, and I knew their face was only inches away from mine. Like I said, I was facing straight ahead, and I wasn't going to turn to face to see who it was. They stayed there, too, for what must have been at least 2 minutes, until I just felt them crawl backwards, and then off the couch. I heard the dog let out a sort of muffled bark, in which time someone shushed her, then let out a good girl. The presence stayed there for what felt like forever, until I heard footsteps going out of the back door. Still, I didn't move. I was paralyzed with fear. But needless to say, I didn't go back to sleep that night. I checked on my friends a bit later on when I felt the coast was clear. None of them had left their rooms that night, and I told them my experience, and they said that was weird and I was being paranoid. And in the end, I sort of halfway agreed with them, and our day just went on as planned. Later that day, after a day at the lake with my friends, we came back to a quiet and cozy cabin. The caretakers of the cabin told us that there was a river a bit farther back into the woods, about a 15-minute walk, and my friends decided to stay back and rest, so I took some bug spray and a small backpack with some snacks and my phone. It was a pretty straightforward trail. There was tall grass on either sides of the trail, and it was a thin path, but pretty easy to navigate. When I got to the riverbank, there were 2 picnic tables there. I didn't want to get eaten alive by mosquitoes, and I had stupidly worn sandals. So I put my bag on the table and fumbled around with some stuff for a bit, and then I started my walk back to the cabin. But for some odd reason, too, the path just seemed distorted. What was once a straightforward trail was now covered in rough terrain. I noticed the tall grass on the side of the path that had been disturbed, and it was as if something huge, and I mean gigantic, had walked across the long grass. At first, I thought maybe it was just a bear, since the locals had told us that bears were a problem this time of year. But the sheer size of it made me sort of second-guess it. I was a bit taken aback by this, but I continued and I made it back to the cabin. Then I went back to the river eventually, and I was a little frightened now, but I kept telling myself that I was just freaking myself out and I should enjoy the nature. I sat down at one of the tables and watched the river for a bit, but after a while I could have sworn that there was something staring at me. I looked around, assuming one of my friends was on their way to prank me, but there was no one. Across the river, I noticed a bit of brush that was shaken up. There was a clearing in the bushes that was fenced off by 2 logs in a sort of X shape. The longer that I sat in that spot, the more worried I became. I just couldn't help but feel that there was something behind the thick brush that I couldn't see. I went down the river at that point, hoping to come across some kind of life, but there was like literally nothing. No fish, no frogs, no roads, just mosquitoes, and a bunch of them at that. Disappointed now with the lack of anything, really, I just went to sit back at the table, and that was when I heard it. It was a noise that I just really find hard to describe. It was a scream, but more like a gurgle, as if whatever it was had a mouthful of water. It was inhuman, definitely, but I froze, and in that moment I should have been running for my life, I know, but in the end I just froze. I heard rustling in the bushes behind me, the ones that I was worried about earlier. Then again the scream, and it was the loudest thing that I'd ever heard. And then I just ran. I sprinted my butt through that forest, and what should have been a quick trip back to the cabin was anything but that. Because after about 10 minutes of sprinting, I finally noticed that I was completely lost. I stopped for a few moments, frantic to see if I could find anything that looked familiar, and then I saw a bridge that I had crossed on my way there, and I started sprinting that way. I thought to myself, why didn't the damn thing just kill me? I mean, I'd stopped for a good minute, and then I could hear it chasing me again. It felt like it was a game for this thing. What I mean is that every time I stopped, it would as well. Eventually, I finally made it back to my cabin, and instead of going inside, I just sort of stood on the porch. I faced the forest, and I just cried. I couldn't see anything out of the ordinary, but somehow I just knew that it was still out there. I didn't want to turn my back to it, so I must have sat there for hours, just silently crying away, occasionally checking my phone, and, well, writing this down. I don't know what the heck that thing was. The only thing that I can even compare it to is maybe a wendigo or something, but I've never heard of wendigos gurgling like that. All I do know is that I will not be going back to that river ever again. If you could please shed some light on what or who might have been out there, then I would really appreciate it. These past 2 days have just been too weird to not be connected. Also, we actually burned some sage that night before heading to bed. Brett, one of the guys there, came up to me at around 4 in the morning and told me that he couldn't sleep. We watched TV for a little while before, again, we hear the taps on the back window. We decided not to check it out because, well, quite frankly, we were scared as heck, but after about 10 minutes the tapping stopped. But Brett and I took turns on sleeping, and no other strange things occurred that night. Brett and I were actually woken up by loud banging on the shed out back, but that could have been an animal or anything really. But at this point, I'm just really excited to get back to my city life and leave this place forever, and all of its weird stuff behind me. Anyway, I had my friend Brett go up into the attic too, while me and some others watched from below, but there was, of course, nothing up there. And to be honest, I'm really not sure if I feel better or worse, knowing that there's nothing up there. I had just turned 20 in March of this year, and I'd started to get out more on my own. I was always shy and never really wanted to go out alone, but now I started to feel a bit more comfortable. I just ordered myself a pocket knife. I actually have a few now, and would carry it with me most of the time when I went out for my daily walks. And this one time in June was one time that I was blessed to have thought of bringing my pocket knife with me. Let me tell you that. So it was around 8 PM when I decided to go for my walk. Usually I would try and go in the morning or early afternoon, but it had been raining all day, so my walk was pretty delayed. I put on a light hoodie and I was about to head out when I realized that my knife wasn't in my pocket. I went back up quickly and I got it and it was on my way. My usual walk is around 3 to 4 miles, I would guess, and I'm a pretty fast walker, so I could cut the miles to about 2.5 hours max. I would take this side of the street to the main road that had a walkway for about half a mile before it turned into the suburban area. But before you hit that area too, there was this path that cut through a forested area that had a few cabins and parks and whatnot. So, as I made my way, I had noticed a figure hanging beside a tree on the far side of one of the cabins. I took a quick glance at him and continued past him. For your insight too, I'm trans male and 5'1", so I would get mistaken a lot for a small 15-year-old kid. But as I made it to the end of the path, I noticed out of the corner of my eye that the man was now about 15 feet away from me. The dude was pretty tall, at least 6'3", I would guess. He was well built and was wearing torn jeans and a worn hoodie that seemed to be a bit big for him. I began to speed up my walking at this as I turned the corner and shot a quick glance behind me. He was still behind me and just staring at me now as he was making long strides towards me. At this point, I was beginning to freak out. He seemed to be getting closer with every step, and I quickly took a hold of my knife in my pocket and had my finger on the flipper. And the next part has been burned into my memory for life. I felt a large hand grab my shoulder and pull me back. I have no clue how I managed to quickly whip around and flick open my knife like I did and swipe it towards his face in just a few seconds, though it felt like minutes. But the man, in a blink of an eye, jerked his face back, bringing up his hand as my knife sliced his palm of his hand. He let out a sort of pained yell and fell back a few steps, clutching his hand. It felt like I had just scraped him, but his hand was already completely bloody, and a small pool of blood was starting to form in his feet. He looked at me with anger filled in his eyes, and then he just took off the other way. I stood there for a few minutes before realizing what had just happened, and I went home as fast as I could to call the police. I answered their questions, and then they took my knife to get a blood sample of this dude. I was shaken from this experience and stayed with my brother for a few nights. A few weeks later, the cops returned and told me that, yep, they had found the guy. And yeah, he was wanted for sexual assault. I was shocked, but also happy that they had found this guy. My knife was also returned to me a few days later, which I was thankful for. For those who want to know what type of pocket knife it was just a TAC Force knife, or for those who might know, a TF 705. Earlier this year, to celebrate the 4th of July, I was having a few drinks with my parents, and as we were discussing several different topics, we eventually stumbled into sharing some ghost stories. I mean, we've all heard each other's usual stories before. In fact, I can write verbatim my dad's encounter with an elf, which I always find myself sort of chuckling doubtfully about. But that night, I brought up something that I've really struggled to come to terms with for years now. This took place when I was around 10 years old. I'm 25 now, so this was about 15 years ago. My friends and I lived in different neighborhoods around the town at the time, so since I was really the only kid of my age group who lived in my little part of the suburb, I would occupy my free time by just riding my little mermaid bicycle on the streets. It was a very lax part of the township, typical of the residential areas that surrounded the city. But one summer evening, I was wasting some time just before dinner, I think, by pedaling my bike up the street. When I was rolling to the T-shaped intersection that I would always stop and turn around at, I noticed two girls my age just sitting peacefully in front of the house opposite the intersection. They were staring at me too, almost as if they were aware of my imminent arrival. Both were wearing light-coloured nightgowns, which I thought was a bit strange considering the time of day, and, well, being outside like that. I can't recall if they were twins, but something tells me that they were, but I can't really remember much detail of their faces at all. As I got closer to the intersection on my bike, they called out to me cheerfully, beckoning me with jubilant arm motions to come towards them. And I did. I felt a rush of excitement toil over me at the thought of having a couple of new friends to play with, so I really wasn't asking why they were outside in nightgowns or even where they'd come from. Because, you see, the people that owned the house behind them were quite elderly. I mean, I rarely ever saw them leave the house at all. The edges of the property were quite grown over too, which made the house look neatly nestled away from the road. The only thing that I thought that was strange at the time was that the slight hill that was their front lawn was covered in sort of decorative river rocks, the ones that are smoothly moulded by water and look like little dinosaur eggs maybe. And that's what the girls were sitting on, barefoot and in nightgowns. How uncomfortable, I thought. They were both talking to me, telling me that I should come and play with them. And I said that I would love to, but I would have to bike home first and let my mum know where I'd be. They seemed less than thrilled at that idea and were definitely trying their hardest to coax me into staying there with them, telling me that I didn't need to tell my mum and that she wasn't that far away. I insisted that I'd be back very shortly and hopped on my bike and pedalled home. When I arrived back at my house, I threw my bike into the grass and ran up to our front door, opening it partially to ask my mum if it was alright if I played with two girls up the street. My mum turned around and seemed sort of visibly confused, but she agreed, so I went back. I rode up to the house at the intersection, and when I did, they weren't there. I was a little disappointed. I even felt bad for having to run home first like I did. I walked my bike up the driveway and then proceeded to walk up to the door, knocking on it gently, and an elderly woman opened the door. I told her the girls asked me if I could play with them, and she said, "What girls?" A puzzled look spread across her face. There were two girls outside just a bit ago. They asked if I could play with them." "No kids here, sweetheart. You know, you're the only kid on the street, right?" And then she shut the door. And after that, I never saw or heard of the girls ever again. Now, as I was telling this story to my parents, I sort of paused midway to make the disclaimer that I wasn't sure if this was some kind of extremely detailed dream that I had, sort of mixed up with my memories, or if it actually happened. My mum, though, she told me she actually remembered that day because she never remembered any children living on our street besides me, and it stuck out to her that I had asked to play with two girls up the road. So, after explaining this story to my parents, I ended up doing some research. And apparently, the phenomena of supernatural beings disguised as children, black-eyed children as they're referred to, is an urban legend. I had no knowledge of this being a thing, and although it's debunked, I will say that it's eerily similar to what I experienced with these girls. I don't really remember them having black eyes. In fact, it's almost as if their faces were sort of blurred from my memory entirely. They weren't acting ominous or intimidating, but they wanted me to stay with them in the sort of worst way. Ghosts, a glitch in the system, black-eyed children, or whatever it was. I'm struggling to find an explanation, as it's just been one of the most puzzling things that I've ever experienced. So in April of last year, my boyfriend and I were just walking home from our friend's house. I had just finished my first year at college, and we wanted to go out and celebrate and just have some fun. We live in a pretty rural town, though, and our friends lived on the far side of it, so our walk was about a half an hour or so. I had a drink or two, and I smoked a bit. Smoking always makes me paranoid, and this night was no different. But anyway, we left at maybe 10 or 11 p.m., I would guess, and everything was perfectly normal. Until we got to the end of a long street that would eventually lead to my house. This street always just felt so long to walk. Like, hours can pass, and you can barely make a dent into the amount of steps that need to be made. But the street we turned onto, this road, was maybe 10 blocks from my house. A few minutes after we turned onto this road, I just felt like something was off. But my boyfriend said that I was stoned and reminded me that I'm a pretty paranoid person to begin with. And truthfully, I am. But then this white pickup truck that was parked in front of some house just turns on and begins to drive slowly away and would then park. I watched it to see if it was just me being paranoid or not, but it proceeded to stop a couple of houses down and just sat there with the car still on. As soon as we would get close to it, it would always drive away, parking a little further away each time. This continued too until we got to the end of my street. At this point, I was telling my boyfriend that I don't think I was being paranoid and that this truck was definitely messing with us, and he had also gone quiet. A couple of houses down from mine, the truck drives to the end of the street, at my house on the corner, and there's a dead end right by my house because we live near a river. It stops for a moment at the end and proceeds to turn on their high beams and begin to slowly drive towards us. My boyfriend sticks his arm out in front of me, stopping me from walking any further as this truck continues to approach. My house is really close, but also pretty far to run to at this moment. This truck then slowly drives by us. The windows are tinted, but we can see two silhouettes, and because they had blinded us, we didn't think to look at the license plates or even the model of the truck. And I swear that I felt like that was the night that I was about to die, or worse. My thoughts hurled around in my mind, and I could see that my boyfriend was in the same mindset. My boyfriend, being pretty quick on his feet though, waited until the truck disappeared from sight and took my hand before racing to my house, and then instantly locking the door. He had thought about turning down one of the other streets so that we could try to lose them, but he figured that he'd wait until they were out of sight to book it to my house so they wouldn't see which house that we went into. But we then looked out one of the front windows, very carefully mind you, and saw this truck come back into view and began to drive around the block, presumably looking for us, I suppose. This went on for what must have been 10 minutes, and I called the police to inform them that we had been followed, but without the license plate or the model, they could only keep their eyes open for suspicious white trucks. I was adamant, though, that these people, they had to have known one of us, if not me, because they drove until they were beside my house. Whether they actually knew it was my house or not, I don't know, but it was really suspicious. My boyfriend tries to insist that it was probably a bunch of kids just trying to mess with us, but I don't believe that for a second. And sure enough, a few days later, we heard that someone was picked up and was last seen in a white truck. Since this night, there have been stories in the paper and online that people have been grabbing other people and these people were trafficked in the area. I'm still seeing reports even today, which prompted this unsettling memory. It makes me wonder if they were some of these people, and if they were after both of us, or maybe just one of us. Or were they truly just a bunch of terrible people trying to mess with us? Either way, I really don't care to find out. So, before I start this, I just want to make it abundantly clear to everyone that, yes, I know I was incredibly stupid, but I was also very young, so you're just going to have to forgive me. So when I was 15, my sister and we actually ran away from home. Dumb decision number one, I know. I was gone for a total of about 6 months, and at some point, for about 2 weeks, we were living in a rundown motel. One night, while I was by myself, I was sitting on the stairs of the motel just flipping through a magazine. Stupid decision number two, when a grown man walks by me and starts to talk to me. He asks me my name and why I'm sitting outside. I ask him if he's a cop. Extremely stupid decision number three, since this shows him that I don't want cops involved as I was a runaway. He asked, do I look like a cop? He didn't, to be honest. He said that he had some alcohol, though, in his room, and that he was willing to share it if I'd like to come up and drink with him. At 15, to me, free alcohol sounded great. So I said okay, and I went to him and to his room. Stupid decision number four. We got to his room, though, and I began drinking and talking a bit. I forget what I asked him, but at some point I asked him something that made him get his ID out and show it to me. Under his name, too, I noticed that it had a fender under his name in red. Warning bells immediately went off at this, and I asked what that meant, and he replied, what do you think it means? At that point, I just wanted the heck out of there. As I'm thinking that, though, an additional grown man walks into the room. He sees me, smiles, and they both nod to each other, and I am now in a locked motel room with 2 grown men. I turn to the first guy and tell him something, like, I have to get something out of my room real quick, then I'll be right back. I must have sounded believable too, because he said, you'll come right back. I said, of course, I want to keep drinking. He then asked what room number I was in, and I lied and I made one up, of course. And by the grace of God, he actually let me out of the room. I briskly walked back to my room. Not even a minute later, too, the phone rings. I picked it up, and he said, why did you lie to me? I said, what do you mean? You lied about your room number. I watched you go into your room, he told me. I told him that it must have slipped my mind as I was talking to him earlier. He then told me to come back upstairs to his room so that we can keep hanging out. I told him that I'd be right back up, and I then proceeded to unplug the phone from the wall and curl up into a ball since I was so afraid that he was going to try and come and get me. I still to this day do not know why he just let me leave like that. I mean, he didn't have to. Lord knows what would have happened to me that night if I hadn't. It's scary to think about since I was a runaway too. No one would have known anything too. I had no ID and I was going by a different name at the time. I eventually looked up what offender means too, and most websites say that it means the person is a sex offender or out on parole at least. Which means that I was very lucky that night. Surprisingly though, it took me becoming an adult to really realize the danger that I was in that night. To me at 15, he was just a creepy guy, and I instinctively knew that I had to get out of there. It wasn't until years later that I just really, truly understood how bad that situation could have become. I was a high school student living with my mother in a third-floor apartment. I used to sleep in a living room because, well, the apartment only had 1 bedroom and it was my mum's. But I was happy with that little space that I had. In fact, I was just a pretty happy kid. I always got up at 6 a.m. to go to school as well, and my mum always got up at 5 a.m. to have time to shower and make breakfast before dropping me at school and heading to work. That morning, I woke up and the lights were all on. Every single one of them, even the one in my room. I went to grab my phone and it wasn't there, which was odd. I headed to the bathroom though and saw that all the drawers and the doors of every furniture that we had were open. I was obviously deeply confused, but anyways, My mum came out of the bathroom and asked me what the heck I was doing. I told her that I didn't know what she was talking about and that I thought that she did that since she's always up 1 hour earlier than me. I also asked if she'd seen my cell phone. And then I saw it. Deep inside of her green eyes, the realization. I could see the fear and all of the pieces inside of her head clicking in place. She quickly leapt to the kitchen and she found the window wide open, a kitchen knife on the ground, and some dusty fingerprints on the wall where someone had put their weight on it to climb inside. It was then when my sleepy head put the pieces together too. Someone somehow climbed all the way up of our balcony, got inside the apartment, and robbed us. All while I was asleep in my bed, right there in the living room. She hugged me and asked me if I was okay. I said that I had never heard anything, didn't even wake up in fact, when this unknown person turned the lights on and rummaged through all of our stuff. But it was super weird. I mean, I have the lightest sleep since I have memory, and I still do in fact, many years later, but I just didn't hear anything. Also, though, they didn't dare open my mum's bedroom door, so she didn't notice a thing. My grandma seems to believe that some angel protected me in my sleep, and that's why I didn't wake up, but I don't believe in that stuff. In fact, I just don't think they knew that I was there either. The police never found the robber, and we put steel bars on the window after that, but we moved anyways sometime after. But this all happened when I was still in high school. At least 6 years have passed now. My mother and I moved from that apartment. Now I'm grown up and I live with my boyfriend, but even today I'm still paranoid and keep asking myself just, why didn't I wake up? Although I must admit that I am grateful that I didn't. One of the strangest and most unexplainable experiences that I've ever had was as a child, probably aged 10 to 12 or so. I was upstairs in my house walking towards the guest bedroom or the playroom. The hallway was lit up, but the room was dark. I got to the entrance of the room and could very clearly see my dad standing in the middle of it, trying to tie a string around the handle of an old wooden rocking horse that we had sitting in that room. I stood and watched him because I thought that it was super weird that he was doing this and not acknowledging me. The tying motions he was making with his hands were really repetitive too, but otherwise he was just standing still. Suddenly, though, I heard his voice coming from downstairs and realized that my parents were downstairs talking. I was gripped with a sudden terror, and at this, I sprinted down the hallway back downstairs. I was afraid of that room for years to come after that as well, and would cover my eyes while turning on the lights, even into high school. As an adult, I'm still a bit uneasy sleeping in that room, and my boyfriend hates to stay in it with me when he visits my parents, but I've never actually had any other weird experiences in it, just that one. That room, too, wasn't originally part of the house, which was built in 1980, and was later added on in the 90s when my parents actually bought the house. I could write it off as just my eyes playing tricks on me. I know that, but what made it so weird was that he very clearly appeared to be moving, and plus I stopped and stared at the image and it just didn't go away. And I mean, typically when my eyes do play tricks on me, it's always very momentary. I don't know. But what do you guys think? My dad is still living there, quite healthy might I add, so I don't know what happened. So, I'll start with a little bit of background story about the property. This house was built somewhere in the middle of the 1800s. It's belonged to my family since the beginning, and my great-great-grandparents built it from scratch when they moved from Italy to Uruguay. The backyard occupied an entire block, so it was pretty big. During the years, the family began to sell some parts of it, so now it's like a quarter of what it was then, but this house has served as many things: a cinema, 2 churches, a bar, clandestine abortion center, and many stores too. Sadly, a lot of people have died here, including murders, natural deaths, and suicides too. The previous owners, some family friends, said that the last nights they spent there were almost unbearable too. Doors and windows would open and close alone so fast that they had to get out as quickly as they could, and the neighbors always told us that they could hear babies crying in the backyard, where they used to bury the fetuses apparently. Cousins of my mother had seen people in the bathroom mirrors plenty of times. The smells would appear out of nowhere, and just all in all, it was a pretty messed up place. But we moved in 2010, and almost immediately, things started to happen. At first, it started with things like stuff would be missing from places where we left them. Then we could hear conversations in a different language in the backyard at night, but after searching, there was never anybody there. But the thing that creeped the heck out of all of us were definitely the apparitions. So a few months after moving in, my mother woke up in the middle of the night, only to find out that there was a man at the end of her bed, with a black plastic bag covering his head. She didn't scream or wake me up, just closed her eyes and prayed until she fell back to sleep again. Now, this became a regular thing too, and we could see different people at any time in the house, and then they would just vanish out of thin air. I remember once too where I went to a sleepover at my cousin's house. It was the same as ours, but just divided by a wall. And when I woke up at 12 a.m., I saw a woman watching me from behind a full-body mirror. I honestly couldn't move, so I ended up just closing my eyes, and when I opened them, she wasn't there anymore. But then I turned my head again, and now she was behind the bedroom door. I closed my eyes again, and then she was just gone. I have many, many stories like this too. On one occasion too, we actually discovered a picture that nobody took in my cousin's place. It appeared to be a baby from another time, maybe. You could sort of guess that by its clothes. But it was definitely the final proof that there was something going on here. So after contacting a medium, she told us that 6 different presences were living in this house with us. And I could tell you like 30 different things that happened here since then, but right now we've just sort of gotten used to this and just live with the knowledge that they're just not going anywhere, and this is where we live. We sort of feel like maybe they're visitors here, or maybe we just tell ourselves that so that we're not so scared. But if you guys want to hear more stories, then let me know in the comment section below, and I'll see what else I can write up. This was back in the 90s when our only option was a landline phone and also dial-up internet. I was around 8 to 9 years old when my mum started leaving me at home with my oldest brother while she went to work. My brother was much older, around 17 at the time in fact, and as most teenage boys, his favourite thing to do was sleep really late during the day and stay up all night playing video games. It was a PS1. Don't come for me, I'm getting old. But I remember being bored just playing with my Barbies in the living room of my house with the blinds wide open to let some light in and save on electricity. I would sit there for hours and play, in fact. When Mum was gone though, she always told us to answer the phone when it rang in case she was calling to check on us and make sure that we were okay. I remember one day specifically, I answered the phone and just heard sort of loud breathing on the other end of the phone. I kept saying hello, but no one would reply, so eventually I would just hang up. This went on daily for like 2 months as well, and it was always in the morning time when my brother was asleep. Being a naive 8 to 9 year old girl though, I didn't really think anything of it, and eventually the call stopped, so that was good. A few months go by, and I'm sitting in my living room floor again when the phone rings. I hear the same breathing again, and I say, "Hello, who is this?" And to my surprise, a man replies and says, "Hello, kitten, do you remember me?" I remember being surprised that he called me kitten, but replying that he must have had the wrong number. And this is where it gets creepy. He then replies, "No, kitten, I have the right number. You're wearing a kitty shirt right now, aren't you?" I remember looking down and immediately panicking and hanging up the phone when I see the tabby kitten on my shirt. The phone then rings again, and I just refuse to answer it. I quickly run up to wake my brother up, and he sleepily follows me down to the living room. The phone rings again, and he answers it, but nobody's there. He then unplugs the phone and tells me that it's just my imagination and to leave him alone so that he can sleep. Being scared, I decided to close the windows though and sit on the couch until my mum got home that afternoon. That night, I told my mum what had happened, but my brother told her that I was making it up and that he didn't see or hear anything. I think that my mum believed me, but she told me to just hang up the phone if it wasn't her and to never open the door for a stranger or anything like that. I agreed, and I told her that I wouldn't. That next day, my mum was off to work again, and she took me to the store with her this time. We were walking around when I noticed a man in a long trench coat. I thought the coat was weird, but didn't really think much of it. We then ran into one of my mum's friends, who has a daughter my age. My mum and her friend were just sort of chatting away, and me and my friend were just sort of standing a few feet from them messing around with birthday cards and stuff. And then we went around to the other side of the cards to take a look there, and we were out of sight of our mums. And suddenly, the man with the trench coat is right next to us, looking at the cards too. He then picks up a card and turns to me and my friend and says hello. Being polite, we responded with a quick hello back. But then he starts picking up cards and saying that he's getting his daughter something and asks what we like. My friend points to a random card and he smiles and says that that's nice. He then picks up another card and shows it to us. And the card has kittens all over it. And he looks directly at me and says, "I'm sure you like kittens, don't you?" I didn't really know how to respond, and I remember feeling extremely nervous, but he smiled when he saw me get nervous, and he says, "Kittens and Barbies, right?" This kicked my fight or flight into action, even at the young age of 8 or 9. I nervously laughed and said that we had to go back to our mums right now. The man then reaches out and grabs my arm. My friend takes off running around the corner to get my mum. The man tries to pull me to the front of the store, but I kick him as hard as I can and go flying out of his grip. He then gets up and runs out the door about the time that my mum makes it over to me. The police are called and a report is eventually filed. To my knowledge, they never actually found the man, but my mum was extremely paranoid after hearing the link between the phone calls and the incident, and she quickly found a new house in the city right over from us, not even a month later. thankfully too, that was the last time that I heard from that guy. But it was definitely quite a close call. From 2013 to 2019, I worked in an outdoor education at many different summer camps and outdoor education centres too in Canada, mostly Ontario, but I did spend a season in the Rocky Mountains too. Having grown up going to sleepaway camp and eventually participating in month-long leadership programs with backcountry canoeing components and whatnot, I was well prepared to lead a group of teen girls from a camp in Georgian Bay on a 2-week camping trip in the Tamagami region during my first year as a counsellor. The region is located between North Bay Sudbury and Timmins, Ontario. This region is home to many provincial parks, wonderful hiking and even canoeing routes, and the Bear Island Indian Reserve too. Our route was fairly typical and began at the Whitefish Falls region, ending at Highway 11 after 14 days of paddling, hiking and campfire making. We had a satellite phone to check in with our camp director every day and in case of an emergency too. We also had multiple exit points along the route. Now, until our second to last night, we were honestly having fun, and it was a relatively uneventful time, besides some mild dehydration and the usual bumps and bruises, that is. Near the end of our trip, we were doing some free camping on the shore of an uninhabited island in Bear Lake that is recognized as a part of Bear Island Indian Reserve. It's a beautiful area, and we were across from the main island that the majority of the 250-person population inhabits. We had put out the fire and had gone to bed when, I would guess, about maybe an hour after falling asleep, I was jarred awake by the sound of a loud motorboat. Obviously, this isn't that weird because it's a large lake and many people use boats to reach the mainland or their homes on secluded islands. However, it was around 11 p.m. now, and things had been quiet for the last few hours. The motor then cut out, and I could clearly hear the sounds of an argument. It sounded like at least one man and a woman, and they were very angry and yelling at each other, although I couldn't hear anything specific because they were too far from shore. When suddenly, the woman screamed, and I heard her splash into the water, and then just complete silence. At this point, I was pretty freaked out and hoping that my girls hadn't woken up, but I wasn't that lucky because I could immediately hear talking from their tent and could tell that they were pretty scared. I was about to unzip my door and look out to see if maybe the boaters had had an accident or something when all of a sudden my whole tent lit up. The light slowly panned across me and onto the tent my girls were in. That immediately made them quiet. In a normal volume though, I was able to tell them to stay absolutely still. The light panned back to my tent and then over to theirs again. I can only guess that it must have been some sort of a boat with a searchlight on it. If anyone has any ideas of what type of boat it could have been, please do let me know too. But after an eternity that was really only about 5 minutes, the light was turned off and I heard the motor engage and fade as the boat drove away from us. I immediately found the satellite phone and I called our camp director, who gave us the phone number for the local police. I called them and they said that they would forward the information that I gave to the local native detachment on Bear Island. I don't think any of us slept that night, and I got up at 5 in the morning to take my canoe out and take a look around. I thought that maybe somebody had fallen overboard and had managed to swim to shore or something. Obviously, I didn't find anyone. There was nothing floating in the water either, although it was a pretty deep body of water, I'll admit. But after that, none of us wanted to camp one more night there, so I called the camp and had them head out to pick up point a day early. And boy, did we paddle quickly that day and didn't really talk much. I think that none of us really wanted to speculate about what we might have heard and what could have happened if we'd made a noise or moved when the light was on our tents that night. I've also thought about this a lot over the years, but whenever I've told people the story, they've always been quite skeptical. I also recently started looking into missing person cases in the area, but not with much luck. If anyone is listening to this, though, and is familiar with Indigenous issues in Canada, they would know that There is a bit of an epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women, and these cases usually go unreported or unsolved. So some time ago, I just got in a loft bed. You know those black wooden ones from IKEA? Well, every night when I would go to sleep, I'd keep the TV on, which sat on my dresser across from the bed, because the noise would lull me to sleep, and I was sleeping in this loft bed. And well, that night, the noise and the light were keeping me up. Thanks, radiation. So I just decided to turn it off in the end. When I did, my bedroom was obviously pitch black, my door was closed, I didn't have any night lights on or anything, and there were no other devices in the room. I rolled over onto my side, facing towards the wall, and I closed my eyes. A few minutes went by, and I was still wide awake. I was beginning to get frustrated because I just couldn't fall asleep. And just as I was thinking about this, I just got the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. You know how you can just kind of tell that someone's walked into the room? Almost like the energy or the density changes or something. Well, I had an older sister who had a bad habit of creeping into my room late at night to steal my stuff, so I thought, okay, it's just Hannah getting something. But when I opened my eyes, my room was still dark and empty as far as I could tell. This told me that it wasn't her because whenever she'd come in, she'd leave the door open a crack and the hallway light would shine through. Plus, she's loud as hell, although she tried her best to be quiet so as to not wake me up. But my room was just absolutely silent. As soon as this realization dawned on me too, just an overwhelming sense of dread came over me. I knew that someone was in the room with me, just as I know my own name. But since the human mind needs tangible proof of everything, I decided to check just in case I was imagining it. If you know anything about loft beds though, you know that those things are loud as hell when you move, since you're basically propped up on stilts in the air. So, as I moved, I tried to do so as quietly as possible so that whatever was in the room with me wasn't aware that I was there and knew that it was there too. When I finally reached the slats and looked down through them, sure enough, there was this black figure in the shape of a person standing in front of my dresser. I straight up knew that whatever this thing was, it was evil because A, malevolence practically oozed from it and spread over my bedroom, and B, this thing was literally blacker than the darkness of my bedroom. Like, imagine being in a pitch black room, and then a figure materializes, no tangible features, just straight up filled in outline in the shape of a person, that is darker than the darkest night that you've ever experienced. That was this thing. I don't know how to, but as soon as I laid my eyes on this thing, I saw it turn its head and look at me. Again, it didn't have any features, so I didn't physically see its eyes looking at me, but it's almost like I could feel it in my mind. It paralyzed me, and then it began moving and walking towards my ladder like it was going to climb up. I shot straight up in terror, knowing that if this thing got to me, something bad was going to happen, and reached out my arm to turn on my ceiling fan light. Luckily, it was literally less than a foot away from where I was. I yelled out some sort of prayer or something as fast as I could, my mouth stumbling over the words in my haste, and as soon as I finished, I just felt this overwhelming sense of peace and love come over me like I've never felt before, as if something was truly there protecting me. When that feeling came over me too, all sense of just darkness and negativity just shattered. I was just so calm and at complete peace, almost like I'd taken a Xanax or something, although I didn't know what that feeling was until years later. And I just flicked the light back off and I instantly fell asleep again. I haven't seen a shadow person since then, but I do feel people and things standing near my bed at night all the time. It'll wake me up, but I'll never see anything. Whenever I feel like I'm not alone too, I'll imagine a white light just surrounding me and emanating from my body and tell whatever it is in my mind that it's not welcome and has to leave. And it works every single time, pretty much without fail. I know some of that could just be in my head, but the experience that I had when I was 13 absolutely terrified me, and I know that it was real. and I hope that it never happens again. This happened when I was maybe 9 to 10 years old, I think. I have a sister who's 8 years younger than me, so she was about a year to 2 years old at the time as well. But during the summer months in Calgary, Canada, my family and another 3 to 4 families would frequently have barbecues out in Bowness Park. But for those of you who are unfamiliar with this park, it's a really large park in Calgary that has a plethora of picnic areas, playgrounds, and fountain areas for kids to play in. The area is large, so you have a 5 to 10 minute walk between the playground and the picnic areas and bathrooms and whatnot. So often us kids would just leave the adults to go play in the fountains or the playgrounds, and it was generally safe enough that this never made any issues. I recall one time we went and we were playing in our little bathing suits when I see this tall guy with glasses and a large cowboy hat sitting on a bench just outside the fountain area, just watching us. I was a naive kid, never had any prior talks about stranger danger or any of that stuff, and his cowboy hat made me automatically assume that he was a park ranger. A couple of hours after leaving the fountains to eat and chill with the adults, my baby sister announced that she needed to use the bathroom. She was nearly potty trained at this point, but not completely. My mother asked me to take her to the bathrooms, which was about a 10-minute walk away. My friend who was about my age came along with me, and I just remember walking with them when a guy comes up to us and says hello and starts a conversation. He was wearing a cowboy hat, and I again assumed that he was just another park ranger. He was asking for our names and our ages and just overall had a very friendly demeanor. So, our idiotic selves talked openly with him. I did notice, though, that he had a particular interest in my baby sister, and at one point even asked to hold her, but she was fussy and just wanted to walk. This went on until we reached the bathrooms, where we said goodbye to him and we went in. Now, this is when even my naive self started to feel like something was wrong. My sister ended up having an accident on herself, and I asked my friend to stay with her in the bathroom while I ran back to the picnic area to get a change of clothes from my mother. But when I stepped out of the bathroom, I found that same guy standing a couple of feet away from the bathroom, clearly waiting for something. And that was when my alarm bells started going off. So I ran back to the picnic area and told my mum that I think some guy was following us, and she came with me to the bathroom. And when the guy saw me with my mother approaching from about 100 meters away, he just booked it, power walking in the opposite direction as fast as possible without attracting any attention from anyone nearby. At the time, I pretty much completely forgot about what happened, and it wasn't until a couple of years later that I suddenly realized that the man waiting for us outside the bathroom was the same man who had been watching us play in our bathing suits hours before this. And so, I can only assume that he'd been waiting for hours until we left the adults after we'd gone swimming to approach us. Also, that particular park did not have any park rangers. I don't really have any idea as to exactly what his true intentions were, but I'm pretty sure that they were not good. So, I work in a group home for the developmentally disabled, and my usual shifts are the overnights, which begin at 11 PM and end at 9 AM the next day. And oh boy, let me tell you that this place is haunted. I've been working here for a solid 6 months now, and some really strange things have happened. In the first few months, 4.5 to be precise, nobody lived in the basement apartment of the home, and whenever you go down there, it's really creepy. Also, to mention, this is a finished, furnished basement apartment with its own kitchen, living room, bathroom, and bedroom, meant to house clients that book for a certain amount of time. Whenever it's empty, though, it just always sounds like something is down there, whether it be a person talking or walking or hearing the doors close or stuff like that. As a result, I keep the door connecting the basement to the top floor locked, but that doesn't stop whatever is down there. One night, as I was awake, I could hear solid heavy footsteps make their way up the stairs to the top, and then I hear the door handle try to turn, which almost put me into an anxiety attack, I'll admit. and led me to texting my co-worker, who didn't help at all as she began sharing her own experiences with the house that have been very similar to mine. After the 4.5 months since I started working, we have a client who permanently moved into the basement. Best thing to ever happen, too. And why? Because we just chalk up all the noises to them now. However, one shift I was working, they asked if I could go downstairs and help them, and I went downstairs and we got to talking, and they mentioned how sometimes that they think the basement is haunted. And I mean, what, right? They mentioned how they sometimes hear walking around, and how one night they heard someone turn on the lamp in the living room. They heard the click of the string being pulled. Another incident too is when the client wasn't home, and due to certain policies and whatnot, we keep cameras in the upstairs and downstairs apartments in the living rooms. I was on the phone with my boss as the upstairs camera stopped working, and they were just guiding me through on how to reset it. While waiting for it to boot up, they checked the camera downstairs and asked me to do a quick check on the client. I informed them, though, that the client wasn't home, and my boss then said that they could hear walking and somebody coughing down there. I can tell you right now that it was none of the clients upstairs, as they were sitting down on the couch the entire time watching TV, and none of them had coughed. So I quickly go downstairs with my boss on the phone, and as I said, there was no one down there. It was completely insane, but the next thing to recently happen was the little black cubed alarm clock that we have. This alarm clock that we have upstairs to go off at 6 PM to remind staff that it's bedtime. Well, on my overnights, I'm just laying in the dark while on my phone just browsing through social media, when the radio of the clock just turns on out of nowhere. The volume slowly goes up, then quickly goes down, and then just shuts off again. And after that, you can bet your bottom dollar that I unplugged that shit. It's in a separate room now, and I'm just done with all of these overnights. I was 10 years old. I lived in a relatively small town in Texas, in a small house with my mum. My mum has always had a very caring heart for those in need, so when my uncle called her one night and told her that he ran into a homeless girl at the local park, my mum offered to help her out for the day, or so that she could just get back on her feet, that sort of thing. When the girl arrived at my house, she said that her name was Laura. Laura told us that she was 16 at the time. She seemed like a bit of a shy girl. When my mother asked what she was doing out on the streets, Laura told us that she'd been kicked out by her mum because her mum had accused her of sleeping with her boyfriend or something. Laura told us that the allegation was not true. She told us that her mother's boyfriend was the one who came onto her, and my mum gave Laura a place to sleep in the guest bedroom that night. The next day, after breakfast, Laura asked to use my mum's house phone to call her mum to see if she could get some of her things from her mum's house. Laura's mum never answered the phone, and we just honestly felt bad for her. I mean, as a 10-year-old girl, I just couldn't imagine what she was going through. Later that day, I remember watching TV in the living room and just minding my own business, but I could feel someone staring at me, so I turned my head where I felt the gaze. It was sending me a glare so cold that if looks could kill, I would have dropped dead. I was confused and honestly a little bit startled. I turned my head away from her quickly and I just went back to watching TV, but I could still feel Laura's cold gaze. I couldn't understand what I'd done to her to cause her to look at me with such hate. And the next day, it happened once more. I was in the kitchen getting a glass of water when I could just feel someone looking at me. I turned my head to the side and I saw Laura's head peering around the corner at me. Her eyes were dark and just laced with hatred. It frightened me, and I felt so confused as to why she was looking at me like this. I didn't want to cause any trouble, though, so I didn't bring up Laura's death glares to my mother at all. Later that night, my uncle had joined us for dinner. He had stopped by to see how everything was with Laura, and if we had any luck finding her a place to live with one of her family members. After dinner, I was washing my plate in the sink when I heard a loud growling sound coming from the dining room. I turned my head to see Laura shaking and growling like some sort of wild animal. My mum and uncle looked disturbed and worried. Laura threw herself into the floor and began thrashing around and screaming as if she were possessed or something. I was obviously absolutely terrified. It was truly a scary thing to witness. I mean, I grew up very religious, and my mum and uncle began praying out loud for Laura while I ran to my room and I just closed the door. And this went on for 2 whole hours, but it honestly felt like forever. I could hear Laura screaming like a madwoman and growling like just some sort of a deranged animal. I don't think any of us knew exactly what the hell was going on. After my mum and uncle had prayed for Laura for what felt like forever, Laura told us that she was free from an evil demon that had taken over her. None of us are sure what had actually caused her behavior. None of us are sure what even happened that night. But I remember peeking my head out of the room to see Laura just smiling happily while she curled up on the couch with a blanket. But her eyes opened and she shot a cold glare at me, and I quickly closed my bedroom door just in fear. I also placed a chair in front of my bedroom door that night and I went to sleep. I woke up the next morning by my mum waking me up, and she told me that she was taking me out to eat at my favourite restaurant. When I asked her if Laura was going, she gave me a serious expression and she spoke. "Honey, your uncle's going to take Laura back to her mum's house. He slept on the couch last night after what happened. He and I were talking when the two of you had gone to sleep, and we pieced together that Laura made the entire performance up last night," she said. She's not stable, sweetheart, and we think that she might be dangerous." As I heard my mother say those words, relief just washed over me. I got dressed quickly and I went to the car to go to the restaurant with my mum. When we got into the car, we saw Laura and my uncle getting into his truck with her, and Laura, man, she looked angry. Her expression was just honestly of a child when you don't give them what they want. They got into my uncle's car though, and they just drove away. I'm 22 now, and I've never forgotten about this horrific incident that happened in my life years ago. And after that day, I never saw Laura or heard anything else about her ever again. 12 years ago, my grandmother slipped into dementia. She was 90 at the time, so it wasn't a horrible surprise, but still hard, you know. We moved her from her apartment that she owned in Las Vegas to a care facility close to our home, about 20 minutes outside of Vegas, I think. Which meant that we actually rented out her apartment to what at the time seemed like a really nice guy. Him and his wife were actually mid-divorce though, and she fled back to her hometown in the Bahamas or something. He paid his rent religiously too, until, well, he just didn't. My father tried reaching out, but there was no response. Finally, he asked my brother and I to stop by the apartment to see what was up. We knocked on the door and he answers, and he looks really disheveled and just looked off. My brother asks if everything was okay, and he just kind of stared at us and didn't answer right away. Finally, he snapped out of it, and then he invited us in. My brother asked for the check and told him that we were on our way somewhere. He kept saying that I can write you a check, but come inside so I can write it. My brother forcefully asked again for the check, and I guess he realized at this point that we weren't going to come in. He looked just really sickly though, and he told my brother that he'd been having some chest pain. My brother told him to go to the doctors or call an ambulance, and he finally gave us the check and then asked one more time for us to just come on inside. We got the hell out of there though, and we gave my dad the check later that night. Now, 3 days later, Metro Police called my dad late at night. He was my grandma's power of attorney and was listed on the lease. They'd done a wellness check and they actually saw a body laying on the floor. And it was our tenant, who, when they gained access to his apartment, they also found a woman's body in the bathroom. Later, they discovered that he had had a heart attack after he killed her. They never went into detail how she was murdered, and my folks had to call in a crime scene cleaning company to clean it all up. But my brother and I were completely stunned that he most likely murdered her after we came to collect the check. but he also could have killed her before then. Either way, why did he want us to come inside? If you look up Kadena Air Base in Okinawa, you'll find a lot of stories about hauntings and paranormal activity happening around that base. My whole family, aside from my dad, who was rarely home, experienced really odd and paranormal things in our house, and we were told stories from our neighbours as well. I was a really young kid when we lived there, 6 or 8 I think, but my memory is fairly clear about some of the things that happened to me. When we lived there, we would tell my mum about all the experiences that we were having, and she would just dismiss them. Finally, when we moved away, she told us her own experiences and said that she didn't want to scare us at the time. And I thought that I should finally share these since it's been a long time. They're going to be a bit jumbled and disorganized, so sorry about that, but it's the best that I can do. So firstly, I had a neighbor girl that I was friends with who told me that she could speak to other girls through the air conditioning vents, and she would drop coins and little keychains down into the ducts for them. Along those same lines, my older sister once saw a black gooey mass ooze from one of the vents at the neighbor's house that she was babysitting for just come out of it. The girls she watched also had loud conversations in their bedrooms and would play with their friends in the walls during their bedtime. Now, I was playing with dolls once in my shared bedroom with the door shut. I remember the doorknob kept twisting and opening every few minutes, and I just told it to stop, and it did. On another occasion, I noticed one of my stuffed animals missing, and my mum has thrown it away, I thought. And apparently, I had actually told my mum that the plush was whispering to me, and I wasn't sleeping because of it. I don't remember any of that, though, but I trust my mum, and I believe she's telling the truth. My older sister and I shared a bedroom with bunk beds too, but we both slept in the bottom bunk together because there was just an odd presence to the top bunk that really creeped us both out. We all expressed feeling extremely uncomfortable walking up or down the stairs, like something was always watching us. Even my mum admitted to sprinting up and down them and constantly checking behind her for eyes and whatnot. My little sister had her own bedroom, and her toys would constantly go off at night, even if they were turned off. My mum also told us once, when we were older, that my toddler sister and her were lying down for a nap, and she heard someone in the room say, "I love you, Mummy." Confused, my mum said, "I love you too." But my sister said, "Who was that?" or something along those lines. And my older sister and I were playing at a friend's house at the time, so it was weird, but there was nobody else in that room. But we have a ton of stories and lots from neighbours too, but I just wanted to share these ones because they were definitely the strangest and the creepiest. Thanks for listening. Oh, and if anybody else has any experiences while living on a base, I would sure love to see them in the comments below. This occurred in 2009. I was 22 years old and was leaving my home state of California to head east for my corrections job. I was driving down the loneliest highway portion of the route, and it was around 3 a.m. on a Sunday. They don't call it the loneliest highway for nothing, too. I mean, I hadn't seen another soul for at least a half hour. I was getting sleepy, but I wasn't tired enough to pull over and take a nap or anything, when I saw a broken down car on the side of the highway. I slowed, and I saw a woman standing next to the car. I approached this woman with caution, rolling down my window just a sliver, because something about her just wasn't right. I couldn't put my finger on it then, but I know now that it was my subconscious just screaming red flag. But I asked her if she needed me to call a tow truck or AAA for her or something, and she immediately tried to open my door. I explained to her that I didn't feel comfortable letting her in, but I'd wait until a tow truck came. She immediately got this look of rage on her face, started berating me. "You're a big man, what am I going to do